So I'm Lai Liang for the Center for Presidential History at SMU. I'm in Washington, D.C. Today is December 15th, 2016, and I'm with James Clad. Mr. Clad, how did you end up working in the Bush administration?
Well, the short answer is if 9/11 had not occurred, I would never have gone into government because although I was joined the Republican Party, it was very late after I'd come back to this country after mostly living abroad. And also because, I had not made much of an effort to become known as a Republican partisan. But after 9/11, there was a great, obviously, mobilization within the American government. And I had joined the Republican Party only in 1998, so 3 years before 9/11. And people whom I knew in the foreign policy community knew that I'd lived in and written about countries where the confession, where the religion is predominantly Muslim, from Pakistan to Indonesia to Malaysia. And I tried to say, yeah, but that's not that's not the Middle East. But they said, no, that's, we're national emergency, that kind of thing. So I was asked to go into AID in the policy side of things, where an awful lot of money was being voted for programs that were thought to be helpful in the Middle East. Whether they were is another matter. And people that I knew, including Robert Zellick and others, were helpful to getting me in. So I went in and then went into Iraq with the first group of people after the invasion, and then left, and then went back in again in 2007.
What was your experience in these different Muslim countries that you talked about?
Well, I was there as a foreign correspondent, and then I was there as a foreign service officer for another country, for New Zealand in Jakarta. And the experience was to see how broad and variegated Islam is. I mean, no one now, and hasn't for centuries, spoken about Christendom as one kind of unified sphere of social and political interaction. So to do so about the Islamic world is stupid. I mean, to be honest with you and blunt. So that was something I knew already, but it was very hard in those days, anger, hurt, retributive mentality of after 9/11 to try to say, look, there is no such thing really as a Muslim world. There are a lot of elements in it, and the faith is held with varying degrees of diligence from one part to another. To talk about Muslims in Turkey and Muslims in Xinjiang in China, and I mean, you know what I'm saying. So I learned to think about it that way, and it was a very helpful experience because, we were coming up with an awful lot of money and throwing it at programs which are broadly designed to make the Muslim world like us more, which is not really the nature of the issue. So everyone was on a learning curve, and that's how I came in.
What was the sense of how people in the administration understood the problem at that time?
The problem? What problem?
The causes for 9/11 and what needed to be done about that.
Well, everyone had a pretty good idea about Al-Qaeda. A lot of people knew them fairly well as a result of our having used these people to be our proxies in a war to dislodge the Soviets from Afghanistan.
And you were in Afghanistan.
I was in Afghanistan as a foreign correspondent, which is very different, but still could see it there on the ground. And, people knew very well that we had walked away in our quintessential American way. When we're bored with something, we just leave. That may be happening again soon in Afghanistan. We'll see. So this knowledge of the problem grew incrementally over time. There was enormous demand to do something, which is another characteristic of the American political attitude, which is we have a problem, let's throw money, resources, talent at it. We have people who are doing terrible things, so let's go off and bomb them, as in Libya, for example, and other places. And so that attitude gets in the way of a deeper understanding. There's a wonderful story from the British Empire. There were a group of guys called the Lawrence brothers. They took over the Punjab in the subcontinent. And London was saying, London was saying, The Russians are at your doorstep. Where is your policy? You're not doing anything. And they sent back, of course, those days it was like, it took a year for the letter to get back. They said, we do have a policy. Our policy is masterly inactivity. It's a really good expression, masterly inactivity, because there's a lot of times when doing nothing is not doing nothing. It's just refraining from doing something and letting a situation evolve. So to wrap that up, I feel that much of what we did was pointless or repackaged by the bureaucracy to look like it was specifically designed to deal with radical jihadi Islam, when it was really a water project in Pakistan that was, re-described, relabeled. So you probably sense that I've got my doubts. But I think we've learned a lot along the way. But at the same time, we were remarkably slow to label radical behavior as radical Islamic jihadi behavior. I mean, we sometimes trip over our political correctness.
I'm really curious, that you said at the beginning that your expertise really was from South Asia, Southeast Asia, but you were drawn into this Iraq project nonetheless.
Yeah.
So when you went in with your background and your understanding of Islam and really sort of the localized richness of your understanding, right? How did that fit in with the ambitions or agenda of the bureaucracy in Iraq?
Well, it would, and there was no obvious fit. I mean, I knew bits of Arabic. I knew polite, religiously inspired greetings. I knew the Quran. I'd read it in English, and I'd lived in those countries where I was awakened at 5 a.m. by the call to prayer and various things. So there was a sense that I wasn't dealing with some kind of alien presence. It was both useful but not directly relevant. Maybe that's the best way to put it. Useful to not be alarmed. I mean, I remember going with another American official, and we were wandering around the alleyways of Rawalpindi, which is, the big quasi-Afghan slum in part next to Islamabad. And people, you just have to know the basic greetings. Somebody's staring at you, it's a stare of curiosity, not hostility. And if you walk straight up to someone and say, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, a few obvious things that you should learn anywhere, like ni hao ma, whatever, you just learn these things. And of course, you break the ice and that kind of thing. I think, we're a very, very big culture. And in these expeditionary wars, when our young 18-year-old kids, volunteers in a place that they know nothing about, aren't on the streets, they're in some Burger King franchise in a base, which is about as far removed from daily life in Afghanistan and Iraq as you can be. So we're not good. Our very size and power and influence closes us off from the wider world. You as a journalist would know this. You've seen it.
What do you think, were there impediments to the understanding among U.S. officials of what was happening on the ground in the Middle East when you were there?
I think that these are interesting questions and rarely asked. I'm in the 12th year of trying to finish a book about expeditionary wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and the whole Western approach, Anglo-American, for intervening, occupying, usually with bad results in recent years. But there was an imperial habit. So we don't really have people who think that way. There was something very interesting about the British, especially in the 19th century, because it ceased being an aristocratic venture like the East India Company or people like Stamford Raffles and all that. It became more a middle class thing where they went out and became district officers and got to know the language and took mistresses and usual thing, usual Guaylo behavior. But they had their ear to the ground. They were multilingual. They were fascinated by the places they were in. Whereas, to be very frank with you, one of the things I stress in this book when I finish it is this lack of curiosity. There's no other word for it. When we arrived in Baghdad, I went down to Al-Mustansiriya, which is the original Abbasid university pretty much in the world. Now, we call it a university, but it was a center of learning. It was specifically designed for scholars to be able to withstand the rigors of the Baghdad summers. And I knocked on the door, and we'd already been there something like 2 weeks. And he said, "When American? Where are the Americans?" He said he was surprised that we hadn't shown up to look at this jewel of the of the medieval Middle East. And I found that again and again, the officer corps was indifferent to that. And it says something about, you're a university professor. We're a fascinating country, but we're very big and very self-absorbed and not curious. So I think that's the first thing to emphasize. If you're curious, then you're going to learn the language. If you're curious, you're going to kind of take an interest in the city and seeing it as only a place where people hide and shoot at you. And to be honest with you, the British have lost a lot of that too. So the conclusion, and to answer your question directly, is we're very effective in our intelligence agencies, and a lot of them are extremely good, but it was fragmented. And that attitude about where we were, and most of all, the necessity to get out quickly. Otherwise, you remember your logic in philosophy in university? It's called phenomenology. It means we know up as by comparison to down. We know dark by comparison, left, right. It means we are the organizing principle. When we're there occupying their country, for whatever grand reasons we hold out, that doesn't cut any ice with the locals who temporarily form alliances in order to see if they can't kick us out. And you can see what's coming in Afghanistan. There'll be pretty ineffectual result at the end of 15, 16 years of what? And then they'll fall out among themselves again, So play the long game and expect that that's going to be the result. But again, this is not a country with a sense of history, even being interested in reading history that's readily comprehensible, the British, for example, but others, and doesn't learn much, so that we think Saddam is evil. Let's go in and invade and unseat him. Bad, bad man. Okay. So after that experience, what do we do again under Obama? We dislodge Muammar Gaddafi from Libya with consequential chaotic results. So you can hear I'm a little gloomy about all this. I don't think that we've learned a great deal. We're going to have to, as our relative national power not declines, but as other countries come up. We're still the greatest of great powers, etc. But, we're not playing the smartest game in the world ever since the beginning of the 21st century.
I want to move us back just a little bit.
Yeah, shoot.
To 9/11 specifically.
Mm-hmm.
So where were you on 9/11, and what was your initial reaction to everything?
I was a Georgetown professor, and my initial reaction was of stark disbelief. These things always seem to happen, like the Kennedy assassination and everything else, on a beautiful day. It was do you remember? It was an absolutely beautiful day. And I was just absolutely struck by the fact that it was an enormous collective psychological shock. As others far more articulate than me have noticed, it was like a collective nervous breakdown. And we responded in a way that fit absolutely President George W. Bush's temperament, which is, face him down on Main Street, on Dodge, and if you're not with us, you're against us. It played very well in Texas and in most of the country, but it wasn't an occasion that would elicit a very nuanced response, which is understandable. And one thing I try to emphasize in my writing for this manuscript is that was the moment in which the world gave us an absolutely free pass to initiate what you will very rarely see described as a punitive war. That's what it is. That's what the literature calls it. You do something bad to us, we'll come back and hammer you. It's a punitive war. I challenge you to go look and do a search for punitive war Afghanistan, you'll come up with a history. So you see what that means? It means that everybody else understood that we were entitled within certain bounds of time and behavior to have our punitive war, to dislodge a regime that had sheltered people who killed a lot of our people, right? But that's different from saying, go in, transform the place, stay for 15 years, try to sell an agenda to people who, for eons, for millennia, have resisted the dictates of outsiders, no matter how well-intentioned. So ever since Alexander, but, graveyard of empires, etc. So, but that type of caution would be lost. I remember after 9/11, I joined the government pretty quickly. What was it? Middle of 2002, and convened a couple of meetings down at Johns Hopkins of people who'd been in our AID, but back in the Cold War and during the Helmand Valley area where irrigation projects and that type of thing, competitive rivalry with the Soviets. And they said, be careful, it's tribal, being incredibly respectful of women, don't barge in, all of the do's and don'ts, never absorbed. We're profligate with our experience. We have people who know, in their guts. They may be older or elderly, but they understand the dynamics of an older and elderly power system in Afghanistan. Excessive, from our point of view, excessive or elaborate courtesy, staying in the background, all of that stuff, and getting out fast. No, it just was never picked up. And new generations of our officers and new people would come in thinking they could fix the problem. And look at President Obama, pretty good instincts, but he came in and wasted a whole year reviewing the Afghan war. And they took the view politically that Afghanistan was the good war because of its origins, right? Whereas Iraq was misconceived, etc. But the world is not our plaything. It doesn't work to our time. It's not a universal stopwatch that we're pushing. It's our political process, and everyone's expected to understand it. So I think that the attitude to 9/11, as I say, collective nervous breakdown, declaration of war, not on certainly on a specific enemy, but in the rhetorical part of it, a declaration of war on a tactic, which is, if you think about it, very weird. So evildoers using terrorist tactics anywhere were ipso facto enemies of the United States. Well, let's be honest, terrorism's been used as a tactic. I imagine General Braddock felt that American people, or, the firing behind trees, those are terrorists. They weren't lining up and getting shot down in nice, neat lines. What I'm saying is, in Israel, the very formation is with the Stern Gang and terrorism, right? Not all, but it's there. But this idea was an overreach, a vast, expansive overreach, and was never grounded in reality. So we set ourselves up to fail. And countries that didn't have any jihadi terrorism, like Sri Lanka, which is facing the fight of their lives, with the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers, who were people who pioneered female suicide bombings, right? Terrorists said, good, we need more money to fight our terrorists. So, and we were happy to have that because they could come in and say, you see, it's terrorism we're fighting. Here's an example. It's, Hindu Tamils who are terrorists. Think of that road. And what was that about? But the entire rhetorical resources of the executive branch, plus a lot of money, went in that direction. And so if you attempted to stand up and say, wait a minute, let's rethink this, you were seen as getting in the way.
I'm curious to know, because of your contacts and your background in Southeast Asia in particular at that time, do you have a good sense of how your friends, your government contacts, high-level contacts in that part of the world, how do they react to 9/11 and the rhetoric that was coming out of that?
Well, they reacted as you expect they would. They had a better sense of what, it would lead to. They had a pretty good sense of what their strong and important associations with the United States would mean for them personally and in their political stance. So Indonesia, for all kinds of important reasons, has been close to the U.S. for many years. I mean, all of Southeast Asia needs something like the United States in the sense that it needs a big maritime offshore power with economic interests there to balance the growing power of China or India or other places. Back in the late 70s, it was to balance Japan, right? So there's all kinds of really important, deeply rooted political reasons to be friendly with our country. But in a situation where, Indonesian masses saw an American administration, and now successive ones, particularly eager to fight Muslims, it played into a bad dialectic, a bad dynamic in which, very quickly we became the bad guys. So that period of saying, what, 3,000 of your people have been killed by these terrible people? Go in, clean out the viper's nest, okay? But not stay forever and talk about, and then allowing the propaganda machines of these despicable organizations to, in the environment we have, the media environment, the free play of information, pictures, images. So all it took was one Abu Ghraib experience, and you could pretty much kiss it off. And we didn't realize that we were in that kind of environment of time limitations of willingness to extend us the so-called free pass from the punitive war period, right? And it's interesting because I'll do this when I speak to people around the country. I'll say, do you know what the response to 9/11 was? They go, what? It's a punitive war. Yeah. I said, there's consequences of that, right? Limitations and also a legitimation of the initial effort. But this is the thing about Jay Garner, who was the first administrator. And I had the good luck to go over. I was supposed to be involved with the creation of a free Iraqi media, but the whole concept was so confused that I ended up not spending a great deal of time, about 2 months or something at the very beginning, 2.5 months. But Garner was a very good guy who understood that we had to get out quickly, who understood that we had to deal with people who'd been in the regime who were Baathists simply because that's what you had to be to survive and have a career in Iraq. But this absolute transformational, they're all Nazis, quote unquote, which is what Wolfowitz used to think, would mean that we would be crippling ourselves for the effort. So, you have to ask yourself, are we interested in results, or are we interested in advancing our agendas? And those agendas may be very important, but they're personal to us, and they often don't have a lot of traction in the places that we're occupying.
Were there nuances, though, going back to Southeast Asia? Were there nuances?
Sorry, I wandered a bit in my answer.
That's okay. But were there nuances in the different responses of different countries?
Yeah, I would think, firstly, the Indonesians, much, much bigger, much more like the United States in the sense that it's a kind of e pluribus unum, in fact, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika is their phrase in Sanskrit. It means out of many, one, which pretty much American motto. And so they have a type of Islamic devotion there, which is considerably more relaxed than, say, Malaysia. In Indonesia, supposedly there's no active state endorsement of Islam. In other words, the religion of the state in Indonesia is a type of secularism, Pancasila, all this stuff. But in Malaysia, because of the tenuous nature of Malay domination after 1969, they say, no, Islam is our state religion, and then they bend over backwards to appear to do things that are defined as true Islamic things for what are often kind of fringe elements of the governing party. So after that analysis, the answer is, yeah, there were real differences. The biggest difference I can point to is that between the Indonesians and the Malaysians. But in that toxic period where America was seen to be doing some kind of anti-Islamic crusade, and where our behavior and occasional very big missteps like Abu Ghraib, but other things as well. The picture of this superpower using remote bombs and drones and everything to fight against, the noble mujahideen who are anything but noble. All that fed this toxic picture in which we were at a real disadvantage, and in which we would have, successive groups of generals saying they can square the circle, they can fix it. McChrystal, Petraeus, all these people were, careerists. That's not all they were. They're honorable and patriotic people, but it also was about career. And so, it's not that is unique to what we're doing. Careerist thinking is anywhere, anytime, but the way in which we get wrapped up about some new approach. Remember all this talk, is it going to be counterterrorism or is it counterinsurgency? What do we do? Let's have a big theoretical debate about it and take a year deciding what we're going to do. I mean, the world doesn't stop. We had allies who weren't consulted, the Australians, the British, had people on the ground. I mean, we're pretty self-absorbed if you think about it. And that's okay if we always pull it off and do the right thing, but we don't. And we don't listen. So get back to Southeast Asia. I think personally, it was super useful to have seen other ways in which you can be devoted to your religion. You can embrace Islam. And that, and in Turkey and the Sufi temperament in parts of Central Asia, is something that comes more easily to Western people who like the mystic approach and who don't think that it's a very good idea to have one particular form of religious observance insisted upon and becoming enforced by the state or by a bunch of crazy people down the block. But so that was personally useful to me. But from Washington, the whole approach was, let's convince the Muslim world, quote unquote, that what we're doing is right. And the impulse was okay. And Bush was never, religious secular in his religious sectarian in any of it. He may have personal beliefs that are, very Protestant, Christian, and all of that type of thing. Man of faith, he is. And he never, when he used the word crusade, it's a word that we often use. But again, it picked up. There he was on tape, and we're in an era where there's an awful lot of people being born, where the collapse of public education is evident across the world. So they were particularly susceptible to propaganda messages which were, moronic. but they weren't being contested. And you don't contest things by saying, no, you're wrong. Let's have a Robert's Rules of Order debate, 1, 2, 3, Charlie Rose type thing. You do it by not doing dumb things, which is where Obama was right. Stop doing stupid, expletive deleted. So the Southeast Asian response is one from which we should have taken some bearings, which is keep quiet, never talk about things in religious sense. But you see, the truth is these are jihadi terrorists. It was convenient, if we're fighting a tactic, which is crazy, to have non-jihadi, non-Muslim terrorists, right? Like the Maoist insurgency in Nepal was also using terrorist tactics and all the rest of it. But they weren't the reason we were fighting. And in Southeast Asia, it became identified as an anti-Muslim response. And we're still stuck with that label. And I hope we get out of it, because it ruins everything. That and the duration of these expeditionary wars. So those two things.
So the reputation of the United States in the public street, so to speak, obviously had a problem. What about in terms of the government, the officials? How did they respond to this shift in the U.S.?
Well, some of them, people of experience understand that we were in a bind. A lot of people know this country very well. It's an open country. Many people, many have studied, right? Graduate school, longer grew up, or completely at home. In some countries, there's even people with green cards who live in there. So they know the place. It's not as if we're some sort of shadowy world power that nobody knows anything about. And they were sympathetic. So the advice would be, well, tone this down. And often we heard them. Some of them who were the younger, the product of, as I say, these education systems which have become not as liberal, and I've used that in a strict sense, in temperament as they used to be, would be more inclined to think of us in an ideological way. In Malaysia, for example, that happened. But, I found it in lots of places because the arena in which the contestation of these narratives, to use this postmodernist gobbledygook, was one in which we were largely absent, or else we thought we were there and we weren't. We were a spectral presence. So the attitude of those governments was generally positive. Now remember, money was there, and so somehow we were able to, and we needed this for all kinds of pretty important reasons, like the increase in the military capabilities, particularly seaborne commerce, Strait of Malacca, Strait of Lombok, all that kind of thing. But coastal radars, all this is in the public domain. There was a provision in American defense assistance to provide coastal radars to, I think, Malaysia, Indonesia in particular, maybe Philippines. And that was justified by counterterrorism. You think, well, yes, I guess so. We need to know what terrorist speedboats are going through. But I mean, of course, let me put it gently, it was multi-purpose, and to increase the capability of countries to track maritime traffic through these important straits that straddle the Indian and Pacific Oceans has a lot to do with the usual recurrent, power rivalries in the world as it does with terrorism. So in Southeast Asia, remember it was called the Global War on Terror with the terrible acronym GWAT. It always sounded like gee whiz. No, gee what? So we were stuck with these things. But it involved very important transfers of defense technology and capability, which were easily or more easily navigated through Congress and appropriations if they were part of the big anti-terrorist, counter-terrorist rubric. And often they had very little to do with it. But I gave you the example of these coastal radars, which were justified for all kinds of reasons. Very few of which were directly related to, terrorist battleships. The whole thing was crazy. So what I'm saying is that people learn pretty quickly to adjust their rhetoric to things that would make sense. And then we had a number of initiatives, many of which were important, like the Container Security Initiative, it's called CSI, right? It was a very smart thing to do. And in Southeast Asia and elsewhere, supervision and dockyard security really lagged. So it's not as if it was all Looney Tunes. These were things which were quite helpful and useful. And just like, this country built its interstate road system. Why? By describing it as a defense move. That's how Eisenhower got all the money. So in this country, defense, counterterrorism, all the rest of it could be used, could be used for those purposes.
Do you have a sense that the governments in Southeast Asia, a few of them perhaps, might have taken advantage of this rhetoric precisely?
Well, look at Sri Lanka, for example. Or look at Colombia with the FARC, the acronym for the drug-involved guerrilla movement that they fought for many years. Sure, it came along, why wouldn't you? If you say we're dealing with a terrible terrorist threat, and particularly they could see that the tactic of terrorism was the enemy for the American public, so therefore you could justify giving an extra appropriation of money to the Colombian Armed Forces or the Sri Lankan Army. Not that they didn't deserve it. It was a case of a very tough and often cruel government fighting really one of the worst outfits that ever came down the road. To have pioneered female suicide bombing, right? I knew Rajiv Gandhi fairly well, and he was killed by a Tamil tiger woman who knew exactly how he'd react if she knelt down in front of him, which is a very feudal thing they do in Southeast Asia. They'll go down and hold the legs, and then she pulled the cord. So not the people you'd want to have living next door. So it's not as if they took advantage of us. These were all things in which I felt we needed to be involved, but it was a very convenient label. So yes, the governments were happy to accept that, but then increasingly, as they didn't want to be too closely associated with us, particularly if they were Muslim majority or Muslim predominant countries where it would play badly in the domestic political arena. So the Malaysians in particular are very conscious of this UMNO youth wing, was always preening itself to be more Islamic than the rest of the country. And then some of like the Parti Islam, the PAS, in Terengganu and Kelantan, would have these fantasy agendas in which the enemy was the U.S. And remember, they had always embraced Palestine as an Islamic issue, whereas the Palestine Liberation Organization said, no, we're secular. But never mind. It's a good example of how before 9/11, the Palestinian agenda, which was, to stop Israeli colonization, that type of thing, became an Islamic issue. And I remember when I was a foreign correspondent watching people go down to the stadium there where all the UMNO and the office workers were gathering. They'd say, Allahu Akbar. And it was about Palestine. And the Palestinians who were visiting were very uncomfortable. But it doesn't matter because that's how it played and how it was manipulated and used domestically. So being too closely associated with us carried risk, although there were cooperative moves that they often made. I mean, for example, Malaysia, late in the day, helped. But in Singapore, for example, we were always keen to get some elements of capability, I probably shouldn't say what they were, into Afghanistan from Singapore. And Singapore said, well, really, we'd like to, but we're surrounded by these Muslim neighbors who are going to give us a hard time for it. Plus, we have a minority of Malay, and therefore overwhelmingly Muslim constituents, to 27% or whatever it is. So that's very, very hard. But we had no answer for that, except to say, we don't think it's that hard. We are a basic part of your security. Why don't you pony up? So we had differences with governments, big and small, in Southeast Asia and elsewhere about the degree of help. And then we also had an approach, particularly with the Iraq War, of saying the coalition of the willing. And so any country which wanted to have a good relationship with the United States, Lithuania or something, would send in people, not because they thought this was the struggle to end all struggles or even we were doing it the right way, but they needed to, pay their premium on an insurance policy with Washington. And that's the motivation, of course, which pops up all the time. It's not just about the global war on terror, but it was very visible there. So, and in sharp contrast to the coalition, which was backed by the UN in the first Gulf War and was responding to an invasion by one sovereign country of another, which is kind of classic, peace enforcement as opposed to an invasion.
Do you have a sense that governments in Southeast Asia also use the rhetoric to their advantage in terms of putting down political dissidents and constraining civil society?
Well, I think that, Southeast Asia is actually quite a good focus for your question because it's one in which you're dealing with kind of broadly, pluralistic societies in which a strident form of Islamic observation was becoming inconvenient for those political structures as well, right? They had to maintain a kind of a balance. And I mean, look in Malaysia, if UMNO becomes too predictably strident in its embrace of Islam, it's very unnerving for confessionally Christians and Buddhists and Hindus, and also ethnically, Malaysian Chinese and Indians and Eurasians and things. They don't feel comfortable. So it's at a certain point, it becomes kind of stupid to be doing that. It is something that weakens national unity rather than playing to it. So they had their own issues with these people. And one of the complaints they had about the way we conducted our response after 9/11 was, what you're doing empowers these people in a way that we haven't seen in a long time. So you're creating domestic problems for us by the type of reaction that you have. But to ask us to change the way this was being played domestically inside the United States in the build up to the 2004 re-election of President Bush was asking way too much. And of course, it's not a world in which newspapers take 3 weeks to get someplace else by steamer or sailing ship. Whatever nonsense is being said in the domestic arena is immediately available to the whole world. So there is no gap. There is no intermediate place in which people, they react immediately, as do American citizens, to whatever they're seeing by way of political argumentation. So anyhow, taking a long time to say, yes, the global war on terror created domestic political problems for these countries, and also, let's be honest, enabled them to increase the power of the state. Special forces, counterterrorism units, all of that was something to which we gave assistance. From big places like Indonesia to small places like Cambodia, they have an anti-terrorist group there. The officer is Manat Hun, who's the son of Hun Sen, the long-serving boss of the country, and it's described as counter-terrorist special forces, but it's also kind of a presidential guard as well. So the global war on terror spawned an awful lot of things which ostensibly fit into the rhetorical groove, counterterrorism, that kind of thing, but actually served a whole lot of purposes which are pretty traditional: maintenance of power, order. And, we had times when it kind of conflicted with our own objectives. We have a man in the American Senate called Senator Patrick Leahy, and is very minded to do, he's added legislative teeth to some of the things that are part of our foreign policy, democracy, human rights, that type of thing, important elements. It's just a question of how you get there. If you go out and lecture countries, if you take the view that Indonesian special forces, right, should forever be excluded from training with us, even though those very same people will be called upon to rescue American hostages if, God forbid, that happens, then we're kind of getting in the way of ourselves with some of these strictures, but that's how it was. We had a particular exercise where the Indonesian acronym is called Kopassus, Special Forces. And going back to the invasion of East Timor by the Indonesians and their behavior there, which was not at all pleasant, we had people in the American Congress saying we should have nothing ever to do with these people. And so we were faced with the need to obey the law, which is not have anything to do with them, and work with them, which was the real world and the possibility of a terrorist action, which happened in Indonesia on a number of occasions, in hotels, in nightclubs in Bali. So it wasn't a fantasy. So the British have a wonderful expression about saying getting caught up in your own underwear. It suggests running along and, get hog-tying yourself, which we're really good at doing in this country. Think of it as, do you remember the, not magician, but what would he be? The showman Houdini, he'd wrap himself up. I often think of our policy as that. Some people just go for a swim in the East River if you want to. But he'd tie himself in a box and chains, and then another box, and throw him in. And then everybody waits. And finally he emerges, and how amazing. And that would be sometimes how we would do things. We'd say, let's have some training with special forces, none of whom were born at the time of the East Timor invasion, and let's see if we can't work with these people. But no, we couldn't do that. We'd have to we'd have to have human rights conditions. We'd have to have an agenda, which we'd have this and this and this. They'd have to be scrubbed completely clean. We'd have, like a pincushion stiff with conditionality, and see if we could then get it past the Congress. So I guess you can see the metaphor. It's why are things so hard when it's important to do things? Unless The purpose is to really believe that the only reason we try to be different from other countries and better is that we have to obey an act of Congress. The idea that people doing what I did, dealing with foreign governments, would make a point of saying, well, maybe it's not a good idea to have child militias, and be listened to and to do something about that, right? There's a lack of trust in the senior officials to do something which is consistent with our, I think, American exceptionalism, which I approve of. You can't imagine the French or the Chinese caring. They don't, right? It's realpolitik pure and simple. Well, it's realpolitik pure and simple in the world, but not only realpolitik. It's realpolitik plus something else, as Marcus Aurelius said, and the ruling part, which is, what makes us different. So there's a great story about George Herbert Walker Bush on the telephone to Suharto. And I was told this. I don't know. I mean, I wasn't listening to the phone call. I don't know where I was, a foreign correspondent somewhere. But he was on the phone and they were going through the agenda. And at the very end of the agenda, his staff had put in an extra agenda item, which was to say, we understand that you may execute some PKI, Indonesian Communist Party prisoners who've been in Buru, which is an island in Indonesia, for decades. And I mean, to his credit, Bush 41, Herbert Walker Bush, said, look, it's your country. We accept it. None of this will ever be mentioned. But if you don't do that, we take it very well. And it didn't happen. And it's an example of, it's not just having a person with a label, Assistant Secretary of Human Rights, or it's not just the Leahy amendments that say, can't do this and let's do this. It's about whether we use a relationship that works to our advantage, the power relationship, to do things which are admirable at the edges. To make those things the sole reason for our foreign policy is crazy. Whether it's governance, it's pollution, whatever it is, then the real business is what Lee Kuan Yew called the world of nation states is a world of beasts. International politics is horrible. The thing to do is to ameliorate the worst parts of it and try and do something admirable and human along the way. And I can never understand this love of legal and legislated morality, which we do a lot of in this country. So I've wandered all over the place. I hope it's helpful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It leads me to my next question, which is, do you think that balance was struck or not?
Eventually. Like most things, Churchill's right. The Americans try everything else that's wrong and eventually get it right. But that's the last thing they do. So, we've got to a point now where we have a much more, I've been talking to friends of mine who were students. Some of them went into special forces. They've come back from our basically undeclared wars in Iraq and against the Islamic State and all the rest of it. He said, you should see the difference. Officers conversant in Arabic, some of them very good. Attitudes of great deference and respect and courtesy to tribal leaders, right? Attitudes that, never even look at an Arab woman going by. You know how honor obsessed those places are. In other words, okay, but wow, did that take a long time to kind of get there? We have an army that's more and more special forces, right? Rather than heavy, visible presence with tanks and various things. In Baghdad, it was so discouraging to see these kids from these deindustrialized valleys of Pennsylvania and North Carolina in a place they knew nothing about. They should never have been there, right? Never. They were targets. And by indicating we were going to stay indefinitely and occupy their country, we provided the glue and the rationale for a space into which Al-Qaeda could walk. So it's not that we weren't justified. And my own view was the invasion probably needed to happen because the sanctions at the UN, particularly the French and the Russians, were going to walk away. And that meant that Saddam could reconstitute the chemical and biological capabilities he had. I think it was just a matter of time. So you can argue that an invasion to stop that happening to remove this person, but then get out was required. But if we were going to transform it, as the rhetoric was then, we're going to democratize this place. I mean, it was fantasy upon fantasy, and a really kind of disgusting arrogance by some people in the government then, that we knew what to do, that we were the sword of righteousness. All of this type of thinking was terribly dangerous. And of course, who carried the risk? 18-year-olds walking in the street.
On the question of balance, do you think that was struck too in Southeast Asia with Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines?
You mean balance between the global war on terrorism and then the kind of normal state-to-state relations and all the rest of it, toning back the rhetoric, that kind of thing? I think eventually.
How long did it take?
Oh, I think it started happening pretty much right away. Now, whether the balance was achieved and maintained is another matter. I mean, we had a president at the time who called a 7 o'clock in the morning press conference to exult over the murder of a terrible terrorist by the name of Zarqawi in Jordan. All right, the world is not diminished by Zarqawi's departure, let's put it this way. But is it something that the most powerful political figure in the world should call a special press conference and crow over? I was with some Arab generals at the time, and they said, hasra, which means, what a pity. Why? Firstly, to exult over anyone's death is demeaning. And secondly, to extend implicit parity to someone we've just eliminated for political and immediate and very short-term gain. What was that about? But how can you stand up to that type of imperative in the American political system? And you mentioned Rich Armitage. I mean, those guys, here was the Secretary of State and the Deputy Secretary of State, and they would read about what was going on. I don't know whether Rich told you this, but they'd read about it in the Washington Post. And I've said to him later on, I said, look, you were far more senior than I. I went out there to see it. I couldn't get rid of the journalist in me because I wanted to view it close up. But why didn't you guys resign? And of course, the answer is, both were military guys before Rich and of course, General Powell. And the idea was, no, you don't resign. You try to do your best and serve the president. And yeah, maybe. But when you're completely out of the loop, isn't the most effective way to kind of change things maybe to leave and then in respectful terms say, this is wrong. But it's not just those guys inside our system. It's the closest allies that came into Iraq with us, the British, the Japanese, and the Australians. And it was John Howard, Tony Blair, and what was the name of the Koizumi, wasn't it?
Japan.
Yeah, Japan. And if they, as I got to know some of their people there on the ground, including my dear friend Katsuhiko Oku, who was the Japanese representative to what became the CPA, but he was killed in near what was Saddam's town in the north?
Oh, Tikrit.
Tikrit. He was killed near Tikrit, and he'd asked me to come along on the ride. So I always think about that. And he said, we've got to tell the Americans that a long-term occupation just isn't going to work. There's just no knowledge of the country, and we're the lightning rod which will come down and attract all of this aggression. And of course, each country chose the bilateral path. The British had a special relationship to maintain. The Japanese had, I don't know, something else, and the Australians wanted a free trade agreement. So, and George W. Bush is a very sentimental and loyal guy. And so if these three countries had come in and said, George, we got to think about this, he would have listened in a way that he wouldn't have listened to the State Department, let alone people down the ladder like me. So there's a kind of comprehensive failure to be clear and also stand up when it made a difference. And the real problem with the occupation of Iraq was its duration and its ridiculous agenda. Just ridiculous. I mean, embarrassing. How anyone could think that that was going to work. A legalistic type thing. And of course, Bremer, who replaced why am I just blanking on his last name? Anyway, the first administrator, what was called Orha, Jay Garner, yeah. And Jay's instincts were get out and deal with anybody who was in a position to know what he called the wiring diagram. And the wiring diagram means, how does this place work? The security services. Of course, you don't want torturers left, but all countries have security services. All countries have people who know how the place really works. And there were people willing to work with us. But no, if we took the view that you're all Nazis, it's so stupid. I mean, even at the time it was stupid, and everybody knew it. And that's another thing that's terrible about government, is I've been in meetings where people say, oh, we're going to do something about this. And they'll bring out the PowerPoint presentation, You know the old joke, don't you, that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. And so they bring out this thing, and everyone in the room, here's the point of the story, everyone in the room will make eye contact and go, oh yeah, here we go again. So what's it for? Are we pretending? And we're pretending, why? We're pretending to do something. I've seen PowerPoint slides by an American general goes, things to do. And then there's an economic box, social box, security, tick, tick, tick. Why are we looking at this thing? Is it suggesting that that's actually doing something? So there's no amount of time that you and I could have to go into all the reasons that staying indefinitely was stupid, right? Because we're not an imperial country. We don't have the experience the British had. Even if the British were in charge, the intervening years have not been kind to imperial grandeur and arrogance, although they did show it very effectively on the streets in Basra the first couple of weeks they were there. But all of that would be okay if we'd gotten out, right? And getting out fast means you keep the initiative. So, sorry, you can see I'm kind of fired up about this, but it's an example of where people had a chance to say no, but didn't. And a lot of it for honorable reasons. This is the president's wish, right? And a lot of it where they just put their common sense and judgment, private sense of what was going to work, to one side and tried to work with the best they could.
You've said so many interesting things there I want to follow up on.
Yeah, sure.
I hope you get your book out sooner rather than later.
Thanks. Well, I'll send it to you for review.
Yes, please do.
And I understand you have a big budget there at SMU. I'm expecting 100 copies.
We'll do our best.
and a book tour.
And a book tour.
Right.
That I can more or less arrange.
Well, that's great.
So, and this came out in my conversation with Ambassador Armitage too. With all of that going on in the Middle East, how much time and resources were actually given over to other parts of the world, like, East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia?
What do you mean in a non-terrorist rubric? You mean?
Both.
Well, one of the things about which I'm proud, and there's a lot of my life I'm rather not proud of, but I'm proud that we were able, beginning in 07, 08, to begin to do the footwork to make it clear that we were still strategically focused on Asia. You see, I say Asia, and you hear that? What happens? It's like the voice of doom. All right. So that began in the second George W. Bush administration. And that's obviously where I was more directly involved as a policy maker, although down the chain. I have no illusions. It was a great job. And because of the nature of the Office of the Secretary of Defense and defense policy, and the fact that everybody was distracted by these two rather pointless wars at a certain point, right? Again, repeat. The invasion of Afghanistan, absolutely legitimate under a punitive war prospect. Iraq, 51-49 may be justifiable because of the direction that the sanctions regime was going and the likelihood that this evil, and really is, weapons of mass destruction, this guy used this stuff, would be reconstituted once the French and the Russians lost interest. But they became pointless, protracted, enervating, resource dissipating wars that the country just lost track of. But because we have a volunteer army, and because the people who are in our army, generally from the, forgive me for saying this, but the lower social orders, I'm just being very blunt, means that it's not middle-class kids whose lives are on the line. So because of all of that, and because it became routine, and because of Washington politics, that's where everybody's attention was, trying out new doctrines, new people, new ideas, year after year. And look where we are at the beginning of 2017. Nowhere in Afghanistan, right? I mean, it's astonishing the way in which we can deceive ourselves. So anyhow, it became obvious because of people who are our long-term friends, both friends because they're with us, temperamentally because they know our country, studied here, have a kind of American association, but also because they need us out in play in Asia. Otherwise, countries which are more assertive, our Chinese friends, but others, will have a freer range. So they were saying, where are you? And I'm sure Rich and other people said the same thing. Where are you? You're missing, right? You've got to show that you give a damn, in big and little ways and tiresome ways, like getting in an airplane and going to some boring association or Southeast Asian meeting, ASEAN it's called, but showing that we were in the game as much as the Chinese friends who showed up at every meeting, right? So that became important and required. So there was we talk about the rebalance in Asia. It was actually a rebalance within our foreign policy establishment to think about Asia in terms with which I completely agree, which is the Middle East has been the graveyard of our hopes and our energies and policies which simply cannot be reconciled one from the other. Support for Israeli, de facto support for Israeli colonization of the West Bank, and yet saying you shouldn't do it, and having the leverage to maybe prevent some or most of it. And everywhere, and not just recently, dual containment of Iraq and Iran. We had let the unipolar moment, as the Chinese say, and the victory in the Cold War completely go to our heads, as if we were omnipotent and stood astride the world like a colossus, and as if we didn't have to be careful about our resources and not get involved in too many places at the same time. So all of that just required paying a little bit more attention. And as I say, my work and my background has always been in Asia. So it was a wonderful time to be working on that. And people are coming to understand that what we were able to do then, 07, 08, was to prepare one of the nicest handovers of strategic perspective, of initiatives up and running, some of which underway, some of which not, to the Obama people, to people like Jeff Bader and Kurt Campbell and General Gregson, and eventually Secretary Clinton, who understood the issue and began to really show that we were in the game. So, that was an opportunity. So although I was just a deputy assistant secretary, the playground was big, and the chance to do some stuff there was great.
I wonder if I could talk to you in your capacity as a professor. Could you draw in a fine point the differences in U.S. approach to Asia in the second Clinton administration versus first Bush 43 administration and then second Bush 43 administration?
Okay, I'll do my best, but it's episodic. And remember, my perspective was as a Georgetown professor of South and Southeast Asian studies, but following the Asia game, and then as a policymaker and op-ed writer and whatever, mischief maker. Clinton. Let's remember, it was the last time in which the country ran surpluses. Government expenditure surplus and pretty close to merchandise account. Well, never it was in surplus, but we were in the game. It was the time in which the productivity enhancing effects of computerization and all of that really hit the ground. And although we were involved in a lot of stupid mess like the Balkans and Haiti and all the rest of it, they were really lower order issues. In other words, we'd emerged in 1989 as the easily preeminent country, a reputation enhanced by the overwhelming victory in the first Gulf War and all the rest of it. So that was the context in which, America was working the world. And what happened was an awful lot of attention went to advancing the kind of non-traditional foreign policy perspective, right? Now, I know the question's about Asia, and I'll get there, but it has to be seen as a kind of global issues matrix, because that's how Washington encouraged you to think. Masters of the universe, we're in charge, we are omnipotent, wherever we direct our attention, we can do things. Remember the idea that this is a can-do country, and then an awful lot of this stuff was really coming into full stride then. Women's issues, gender, governance, environment, all of that. And this is not to demean their importance, right? Go to Beijing these days. I was in China 2 weeks ago, and I actually begged off going to Beijing because he couldn't land an airplane there most of the day because of the smog. So these are real things. And people were interested in getting involved in that. And then the human rights question, all the rest of it. So that is the context or the prism through which a lot of that should be seen. So the old-fashioned, what they used to call in the Cold War time, area studies. You'd know this, because Yale, of course, was a place where you'd go to do a lot of that as well, Cornell, Berkeley. So area studies became more and more constricted because everything's global, right? Let's not talk about governance in the Balkans and governance in Eastern Indonesia. It's the same thing, same problems. Well, yes, it's human greed, passion, double dealing, oppressive behavior and everything. But beyond that, there's an awful lot of cultural distinctiveness, right? So no, the attitude was global issues. We created an assistant secretaryship. Former Colorado Senator Tim Wirth was in charge of this. And so it became a bureaucratic thing, right? Carter created Deputy Assistant Secretaryship of Human Rights. And so that became turf in the State Department. And a lot of this stuff was reflected in the kaleidoscope of government function. So I'm painting that picture because it's important to see that that's how interest in Asia arose. And then, of course, BEM. Have you heard this expression? Big Emerging Market. That was the acronym. Ron Brown, who died in that plane crash in the Balkans, but they were out, being aware that Asia was rising, right? Some of the stuff I'd done, Far Eastern Economic Review, writing a book about Asian capitalism, was all part of that period of, hey, we better get on board this train. So it was driven by commerce, right? There wasn't much of a sense of the Chinese being out there in the horizon in the first Clinton and second Clinton administrations. The face, not quite face off, but the humiliation we gave to the Chinese over sending not one but two aircraft carrier groups off Taiwan when they were reacting to the DPP's move, it seemed, toward quasi or real independence. That was something that someone in the Politburo, I forgot who, said, we have a missile that can reach Los Angeles. Well, somebody compared it to like a really big, dumb water buffalo. Here's the Pentagon, Cold War creature, missiles. By the way, remember, nothing stopped. There was no peace dividend after the end of the Cold War. We had to have all those missiles, all those bombers, all those submarines, everything, right? But the whole configuration was post-Cold War, post-Second World War. And then, so that was it, and the enemy being the Russians or somebody else. Remember, this is pre-9/11. And suddenly here are the Chinese saying they have a missile that can reach Los Angeles. Well, someone said it's like a water buffalo standing there and someone going up with a great big 2x4 and going, bang! And the buffalo goes, what? What's that? Bang again, and turning to look. And that was the time in which the look turned. Tons of reports. Everybody's always writing reports, think tanks. The shelves are groaning under the weight of all of these prognostications. But psychologically, that was the moment when we went, who are these guys? So that was Asia in a security sense. It was all, the sense of getting to know the Indians. But to show you how unrealistic we were, the response to Pokhran, which was the place where the Indians had detonated their first nuclear explosion. Actually, it wasn't their first. They'd had what they called the PNE. Have you ever heard this expression? Peaceful nuclear explosion. Oh, I get it. Peaceful nuclear explosion, 1974, as opposed to the non-peaceful, the NPNE. I tell you. So we had, but of course the Democrats are much more well-disposed toward the non-proliferation crowd. And remember, my dean at Georgetown was Robert Gallucci, and he was the lead force behind the 1994 deal with the North Koreans, which fell apart, but it was attempting to restrain their nuclear weaponization plans. Anyhow.
He was in Dallas recently.
Yeah, that's right. Gallucci was?
Yeah.
He's a very good guy. As a friend, I'm proud to call him a friend. He lent me his house out in out in the western part of Virginia, so I could do some writing for my book. I still haven't finished the book, but it was great being out there. Anyway, I learned a lot from him, and he said, because I was always for this kind of realpolitik, balance of power. We need to work with the Indians. Don't talk about China. Just they have interest in restraining Chinese power. We have interest in restraining Chinese power. Let's work on that basis, right? And not talk. Whereas Gallucci said, no, you're rewarding a country which has tilted against the non-proliferation norms. And of course, that's his career. And he's right. So it's a question of a trade-off. Well, the trade-off was very much towards, here's another example of the dual containment thing. After Pokhran, we expended enormous effort to say to the Pakistanis, well, don't you test. Don't you test. And then all this effort and back and forth, and it was just inevitable if you knew the region that they would. There was just, you could set your watch by it. You could make a bet and sleep safely and comfortably at night knowing that it would happen. So that's an example of where the kind of, don't get me wrong on this, because nuclear proliferation is like insanely dangerous and it's only getting worse. But the idea that we were going to be able to strong arm these countries into stopping it and reversing the weaponization and development thing was dreamland. So you see what I'm saying? So that, in a sense, were the defining parts of the Clinton administration. Economic growth in Asia, beginning to pay attention, people like John Wolfe, who was ASEAN coordinator and looking at ASEAN infrastructure. The energy business began to be very important. The financial crisis of late 1997, where we completely mishandled the response. We appeared as overbearing, lecturing. There were even photographs of someone from, I don't know, maybe our Treasury Secretary, standing cross-armed next to President Suharto as he signed a note acknowledging the need for IMF discipline. What did the Chinese do? Offered, never gave a dime, but they offered $1 billion credit to the Thais, who were in a real balance of payments crunch. In other words, we came across as preachy, ineffectual, neo-colonial, and, not very astute. So those are the elements that come to mind as I think of the Clinton period. Am I going on at too much length?
No.
Okay. So, and again, in the academy, I mentioned Asia again and the sound. In the academy, again, I had a foundation professorship from the Luce Foundation, which has always been thinking about Asia. But most of it, the temperament at the time, was global issues. So instead of vertical lines of compartmentalization, or the lack of, but regional studies, it became horizontal lines of gender, women, environment, governance, human rights, and freedom of the press. Remember, we were all fired up with this stuff after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So we had groups like Internews, which is funded by AID, going out there saying, well, it's not just Eastern Europe that needs to develop a free press. Everybody does. So we were out in the world being kind of missionaries for, 100 noble causes. And at the same time, not one real change to the huge defense apparatus that had been created during the Second World War and then expanded in the Cold War period. So broadly, that's the first and second Clinton administrations, and very simplistic, and there's a lot more there as well. Attitudes to Japan were, one of the real points of continuity in our relations with Asia has always been the way in which Joe Nye and who's the other guy? Rich Armitage always come out with every every 4 years, a report saying Japan's really important, which it is. It's the most important alliance. Well, sure, it could be. Maybe certainly eclipses the British. It probably is the most important alliance. But so there were points of continuity there. And remember, that time was the time in which we had movies coming out called, Setting of the Sun or Rising Sun. It was Sean Connery fighting a bunch of Japanese capitalists who were going to take over the world or something. So we had this, we forget this, that Japan was seen as, the country that was going to take over everything. It had bought Rockefeller Center in Manhattan, so
everybody was learning Japanese.
That's right, learning Japanese, all the rest. So we had that sense, and that was when the bubble hit, but it took a while for Americans to realize. Yeah, you realize that academic fashion in this country, and particularly the city, trumps everything else, so to speak. We have a situation where, suddenly it's Asia rising, and we need to be playing the markets. And then remember, it was the time of the Washington Consensus, and you remember that, where through our preeminence in the multilateral banks, not just the World Bank and the IMF, but ADB, we go out there and preach policy reform. We're very good at preaching. So that's the prism through which Asia was seen, largely conceptual, generic rather than geographic, and then our own preconceptions about what foreign policy is, which expanded enormously, right? Democratization is another one. So that roughly is pre-9/11, pre-George W. Bush, with a lot of empty gaps. And I'll probably call you up at 3 a.m. and say, oh, I just thought about this other thing. But W came in, saying, we're not going to go out and nation build. And they had some ideas about Korea, which they attempted with a seminal lack of success to bring in, which was to be tougher, not tougher in the sense that we wanted war with the North Koreans, but just that we were in this trap where we were played by the North Koreans all the time. And we thought, well, maybe we should just lift the stakes a bit and see if we can't drive these people to the ground. But that was the time of the North Korean famine as well, in the late 90s and early 2000s. And to his great credit, Andrew Natsios, who's actually down in Texas doing something. He's at George W. Bush Institute. You ought to talk to him, actually.
He is on my list. Actually.
Yeah, Andrew Natsios.
I realized he was there.
Yeah, well, he was administrator of AID, and to his great credit, he insisted that there should never be a famine on his watch. So he was an important voice and somewhat resented voice, by the Rio politicians on North Korea. He's a very good guy, and I hope you'll give him my best wishes. So North Korea has always been, in a sense, it's kind of its own issue. Just like in this town, Israel, is its own issue. It's often a defining metric of what the Middle East means for us, which has been a problem too, with the decline of what they call the Arabists at the State Department and the strength of the Zionist lobbies. So W, after 9/11, we've just had some discussion about what that meant in Southeast Asia and all the rest of it. But it has to be seen as the confusing metric of counterterrorism and post 9/11 and the rise of China, which was seen as benign and, panda bear hugging sort of China, because conveniently they're all going to become middle-class consumers and do things the way we do it because they admire us so much. And because capitalism has inherent logic, right? Property owning, class, that kind of thinking. In fact, possessive individualism is the real basis of Locke and Montesquieu and all of those theories about democracy, which are based on a property owning middle class with suffrage and all that kind of thing. So all that was very big. Wall Street Journal loved it and all the rest of it. But of course,
didn't Condi Rice refer to China as a strategic competitor?
I think she did, and I don't know when she did this. Would she do it as Secretary of State?
It was before.
Was it before?
Yeah, it was before.
Oh, may have. I mean, all of these, it isn't just like one perspective and another. It's a question of when one view begins to eclipse another, right? But yes, indeed, I think that was noticed. And also the Republicans are much more mindful of that than the Dems. The Republicans in Congress were very prominent in what they call the Congressional India Forum. And they sometimes rather crudely described India's place on this chessboard vis-a-vis the Chinese. And of course, the Indians resent the idea that they're, which big, powerful, wonderful country, etc., should be just seen by us as a chess piece, on the chessboard of grand strategy. And so that's always a mistake. But that's how Republicans who thought about those things saw the emergence of improved ties with India, very much in we both agree about the need to restrain the Chinese, which I think is true. How visibly we do it, how much we go talk about how wonderful we are and we're the two biggest democracies and all that stuff, which has always gotten in the way of statecraft, in my opinion, rather than helping it. That became important. So we began to think of China as sort of coming at us in one way or another. Initially, economic competition. Strategic competitor, well, you talk to American military people. It's taken them a long time to take Chinese military capability pretty seriously. And to some extent, it's not an unfounded, I wouldn't say contempt, but a disparaging attitude. I mean, last time China fought a war, they were trounced by the village militia of Vietnam in 1979. The Chinese set brigade-level coordinates of a certain point on the maps and said you have to be there in 2 weeks. I've forgotten what the thing was, but at enormous cost. People forget that the Chinese, the PLA, lost more people killed than the entire American death toll in Indochina wars from the 50s to 75 in 2 weeks. So that's the military record of the Chinese. And then on the sea, they've got a lot of new stuff. Do they know how to use it? Not at all clear that they do. And of course, you won't see that in the writing because everyone goes, oh my God, the Chinese are going to have a third aircraft carrier. Okay. But just as we're learning, aircraft carriers are really vulnerable, big boats that are easy to find and blow up. So it's complex. But that business with Kaohsiung in the mid-90s focused the Pentagon on the Chinese, who at the time had, I forget what they're called, Jin class submarines. They were just beginning to build them. And one of them was known as the noisiest submarine in the world. All vessels, no matter how quiet you're trying to make them, have a sound signature, it's called. And so anyone you'd have the microphones on, and if the Chinese submarine came within range, you go, oh God, that's too noisy. Zooming by. But things have changed. They have a lot more now, a lot quieter, and they know what to do a lot better. But still, it's a question of experience and capabilities. And one of the things that troubles me, I've just come back from Shanghai talking to their Shanghai institutes, is that they tend to regard the Japanese as a kind of mascot of the U.S. And the Japanese have a maritime experience. And the maritime experience is founded in 3 surprise attack victories against China, Russia, and us. So I said, don't be so smug. They know what they're doing. And so there's that sense of kind of coming to deal with the Chinese as a strategic competitor. And then, of course, as we saw offshoring, and we see the culmination politically in the United States with the election to the presidency of this completely, what do I say about Donald Trump? As an improbable candidate, I don't want to be insulting. It's just that, he's not someone that I was initially minded to support.
We'll have to leave that for another
conference. Exactly, that's another one. So anyway, pressing on, we did W1 and 2. One was the GWAT period, in which we kind of created a world in which we were seen. We'd made ourselves to be crusaders against Islam, and I mean all of this simple-minded caricatures acquired more force because of behavior, because of domestic politics here, because of Abu Ghraib, because. So the second one, we see a period of a rebalance. Right, the strategy itself, very unfortunately described as the pivot, right, halfway through the second administration, or was it at the beginning? I can't remember. When did Obama go to Australia and make that announcement? Might have been 2008.
Yeah, it was the first.
Yeah, it was the first. So the rebalance is also a rebalance of our own strategic prioritization here. Not as much as it should be, because maniacs with knives and who behead people have very quickly captured the American public's sense that they're the most dangerous thing in the world. Whereas the most dangerous thing in the world is that we let our advantages slip away wherever they are, but particularly the Western Pacific. But the problem is that requires an attention span, which is not in the news cycle, right? Whereas somebody getting killed, and then remember the jihadis always look like bad guys, bearded ruffians, and whereas China's not just a military danger. They're a big, interesting, dynamic place in which there's a huge amount of interaction. On the plane back is a business class seat in that wonderful upstairs of the 747.
I've not been there.
Not been there? Well, anyway, we're sitting next to, and there's a Chinese lady who spoke no English. And she turned out to be a very senior police officer who's visiting her son, who's studying at the Illinois Institute of Technology. And I got a very nice note for him saying, what he said was, "In your broken, pathetic Chinese, Professor Clad," just, maybe 15 words or 20 words, but we managed to have a really fun conversation. I mention it because here's a senior Chinese People's Police, and the People's Police in China is a complex paramilitary group with as many armored cars as the People's Liberation Army has, right? Many of them in Western China. So this was a very senior figure coming over to see her son at the Illinois Institute of Technology, who's one of, 200,000 Chinese nationals studying in the United States. In other words, it's not like the old Cold War. It's a market-based, economic, competitive, vibrant, innovative society, which, by the way, is accumulating big, still local power capability, in a traditional military sense. And it makes it hard for us to continue to steam through the Taiwan Strait, which we do periodically. And that's usually kept quiet because the people who need to know are the ones who know already. And that's the best way to have diplomacy with the Chinese. You may sense along the way that I've kind of been enemy of an awful lot of this public diplomacy because it leads to foolish things being said in microphones and playing to the wrong side of the constituency. Like a lot of our public diplomacy after 9/11 just was like a boomerang effect. We'd say something and look at what it did in Southeast Asia. Empowered really very undereducated youth to see us as the enemy and then to become enamored by bombings and various things. But those countries out there have their experience with Islamically inspired separatist movements, Darul Islam in Java, things in Sumatra. So there's, it's not as if the American response to 9/11 ignited all of these things. So anyway, that's my sense of the kind of defining characteristics of the attitude towards Asia in successive administrations.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit more in terms of the shift from George W. Bush 1 to George W. Bush 2. How much of it was structural? I mean, some of it sounds structural from what you already said, but how much
structural international politics sense? Right. Yeah, a lot of it was.
With the rise of China and so on. But also, how much of it was just a recognition that maybe the global war on terror was wrapping up, at least in Southeast Asia, or just governments in Southeast Asia saying, look, you're so singularly focused on counterterrorism, but all these other things are happening that you need to pay attention to. So I guess I just want you to give me a sense of how you might weigh the different factors.
Well, I think you just touched on everything. Just play your own voice back and take that as my answer, and there you are. No, remember, we have very good people in the State Department on the ground saying, wait a minute, let's rebalance here, right? The rebalance is within our system as opposed to, in addition to rebalancing toward Asia. You had people who wanted to show between Bush 45-1 and Bush 45-2. I think the difference became
Bush 43. You mean?
Yeah, Bush 43. My apologies. I think it became. Firstly, it's kind of hard to describe this in terms that are both coherent and make sense. But we're a country of fashion, right? And the idea that remember Disraeli said a country has no permanent friends, permanent interests. That kind of following the line for the long term is something that we don't really do very well. We do, in some sense, our grand strategist, Henry Kissinger, blah, all of that. But the country doesn't really think that way. So counterterrorism, I wouldn't say became boring, but it became part of the landscape. It wasn't new anymore, right? These people are enemies. Okay, we'll find different ways to fight them. And we have fought them. I'm not describing a litany of failure. I'm just saying a big, big distraction from the maintenance of our overall position. That's what the Middle East is generally, and that's what the counterterrorism thrust is specifically. And then real domestic security stuff. I mean, you've seen what's happened here. We're really lucky, but also we're really good at having prevented some pretty nasty threats. So a few of which I know and can't talk about, and many of which I don't know, but believe my friends who work in that area saying, we have headed off some nasty things. So it's not like we're inventing this problem. It's just that our response to it in a public diplomacy sense, and maybe other ways too, has been suboptimal, to put it mildly, and maybe exacerbated our problem. So that is the point. The difference between the two administrations were, of course, the whole question of the Iraq Study Group, which involved people like Secretary Gates and others, 4 Dems, 4 Republicans, saying, we've got to rethink this. It led initially to something that seemed somewhat at variance with what the Iraq Study Group had said, which was the surge, right? And in the end, it didn't make things better for us, didn't create a nice liberal democratic state in the Middle East. As Secretary Gates said, it didn't create Valhalla, it's a lovely place. But it did, reverse the real deterioration situation. But again, you have to ask at what cost? And is this an optimal issue for us? And cannot statecraft, with the usual statecraft, is kind of a grubby business. Look at all the people in Asia and Southeast Asia whose parents are in the Politburo, the political system, who end up getting internships at Goldman Sachs and Wall Street. That's part of statecraft too. And it's a lot less expensive than sending armies and aircraft carriers. So that type of thing, we were playing with China as well. It's just that the convergence, particularly given Han chauvinism, which is a really interesting factor in the overall Chinese perspective on the world, is such a big thing, which we don't really understand very well. But anyway, back to the difference. The global war on terror, or the counterterrorism thrust, became institutionalized, right? So part of what we do, rather than, oh my God, what shall we do? How will we respond? Secondly, rise of China commercially, offshoring, a real sense that, wow, it's nice having a market economy out there, but they're really growing fast. And they may crowd us out. They may take our place in the sun. We're number one, this type of thing. Then the question of the real intent of China to become, at least in the Western Pacific, East Asia thing, a real competitor. That is to say, should things reach a point where there are armed hostilities, we will think twice before taking on these people. The move to send those 2 carrier groups to Taiwan in the middle of that crisis where the Chinese were test firing missiles to the south of the island was a big point that we often forget. It was like the Russians deciding after 1962 in Cuba that they were going to build up a navy, right? I think it was the same thing with the Chinese. So we began to be aware that, wow, 96 or whatever it was, 95, 96, has led to this intent arithmetically every year, and the spending on it, the widening of capability, the toe-to-toe aspirations were real. They're, as it were, coming at us. So that was the time in which Congress mandated an annual report on Chinese military power, which is one of the best annual congressionally mandated reports there is, coming out of DOD. So we began to see this place as not Cold War rival, but as a place where one of the elements of competition was strongly competitive, and the others were interactive and all the rest of it. And so that's why the best speech of that perspective, which is cooperate but hedge, is Robert Zellick's speech in Shanghai when he was Deputy Secretary of State. And Zellick, again, both in that job and as head of the World Bank, understood that we had to accommodate this rising power in ways that didn't mean we lose, they win, but in ways that recognize, wow, they easily have the highest foreign reserves in the world. Maybe they're going to need to be a bigger part of the World Bank. And I think that this is where the Obama administration dropped the ball. Infrastructure bank and all of that. So that kind of captures, I think, the sense of the counterterrorist moment, it becoming part of the firmament, part of what we do. And remember, we worked with the Chinese. They were able to get us to declare the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, East Turkestan Front, ETIM, as a terrorist organization. I think it was a big mistake. We shouldn't. I think it's mostly a reaction to behavior by Beijing in its western provinces, Gansu also, but Xinjiang especially. I traveled out there just before 9/11. It was actually 3 days before. I went down the Karakoram highway. We were talking about things that we'd done in our past. And I went out to Urumqi and Kashmir, Yarkand, and then went down over the Himalayas.
Wow.
And it was an amazing experience, which you can't do now. But I saw how how colonial the Chinese were in Xinjiang. I mean, it was really depressing. So, but the Chinese said, well, yes, we'll support you in your punitive war against Afghanistan. I mean, we'll be on your side, but you have to declare ETIM as a terrorist organization. Maybe not the smartest thing to have done, both a cause and effect thing, and then also just cynical realpolitics. Why give away something when we didn't have to? But what I'm saying is there is collaborative interaction to this day with our Chinese friends, and I say friends not in any snarky way, but they are in this issue. They think a lot about terrorism in China. It's not an invention. Some of the Uyghurs have really gone off the edge, stabbing incidents in the Beijing railway station, that kind of thing. And they are, willing to work with us. And of course, China's big imponderable is what do they do with Pakistan? I mean, Pakistan's a semi-client state. How many meetings have I been in with Pakistani officials say, well, you're so unreliable. But our Chinese friends, lips and teeth. You remember the old phrase? With us all the time. Why? And yet, like recently in Shanghai and on other visits, I'll say, the Chinese, especially the people in Shanghai, very fluid, very nuanced. They're not, Beijing types. And I'll say, what about Pakistan? And that's the one time when they always look away. They go, and they look at each other because they don't really know what do we say about this place that we really don't like, right? And I said, well, think about it. Your only true friends in Asia are North Korea and Pakistan. Is that where you want to be, a country? But I said, you guys don't really play multilateralism very well. We don't either often, but we know it and can do it. Whereas there's a kind of line up and be counted attitude that I guess goes back to the tributary state mentality in Southeast Asia and all of that. So I'm wandering a bit, and I hope some of this is useful.
It absolutely is, really, believe me. You mentioned multilateralism.
Yeah.
And I want to follow up on that. There's criticism that whether with global war on terror or on other issues.
Am I still in focus? Yeah.
The United States tends to be bilateral. It builds on its bilateral relationships.
Well, all great powers prefer to have I'm the big guy, and well, I'll talk to you, Grenada or Trinidad or Jamaica, one-to-one. They don't like collectivities coming together to leverage power up.
Mm-hmm. So would you agree or disagree that there was, in fact, some movement towards a more multilateral approach?
Well, remember, the Dems love it. The Democrats they call it regime formation. In political science, there was a lot of writing about this. People at Dartmouth, I forget the name of the people, but it was all sort of a subculture of that luxuriant academic garden called, international politics and structural politics and all of these things. And it was part of the trade bloc mentality in the 90s, right? NAFTA. And there would be an ASEAN trade bloc in the EU. So people were thinking in economic terms of blocs and all the rest of it. So what was the question again? Sorry.
Would you agree or disagree that there was a movement from a more bilateral approach to a multilateral?
Sure, and I think it was driven by the idea that we're in a world where trade blocs, and demonstrably do, if you look at palm oil being sold to Europe. Having an ASEAN position leveraged the position of producers rather than if they'd Indonesian, Malaysians, Brunei, Sabah had gone to Brussels separately. So demonstrable force multiplier, as we say in the Pentagon.
Right. But in terms of the U.S. approach, would you say the
Well, U.S. approach, I mean, Clinton embraced NAFTA with support. The U.S. approach was to not get in the way of other blocs because it would enable an easier negotiating round. I mean, at the end of the day, trade diplomacy is the most exhausting thing because you have to line up this person, have to line up that. I mean, look at the TPP. I mean, just the effort that's gone into keeping everybody kind of in line. Are you all right with this? You all right with this? Well, it's a week later. You still all right with this? We're going to tell this guy that. And, it's very complex. So if you can reduce that complexity with blocks, just as a process issue, it's probably better for you. But when it comes to the exercise of raw or comparatively raw American power, like everybody else, we want to have a disproportionate power out there, right? And so we do. I just think we mask it a bit better. So, for example, there's a Caribbean microstates. They're all in some 14-country thing. It's obviously so unimportant I can't remember it in the context of things. It sounds arrogant, but you know what I'm saying. There's a South Pacific Forum, right? Which is all about growing up in New Zealand. We all know about these places that people can't even pronounce, such as, Kiribati is spelled Kiribati, and only if you've lived in the South Pacific do you know it's Kiribati, and you think, So these are interesting equities. Everybody wants to be noticed in Washington, so that's another way to be noticed. Quite an important point, actually. That if you're the Caribbean, whatever that thing's called, free trade group or something, the Central America had one, and that's a better way to go in and be noticed rather than the foreign, the trade secretary of Barbados wants to. I mean, who's got time? I'm just being blunt. So the question of multilateralism it received a real kind of conceptual endorsement from the Democrats, from the Clinton people in particular, who thought multilaterally in other ways too, non-proliferation, which we've talked about, right? Arms restraints. And then multilaterally had been part of the process which moderated and then ended the Cold War, the Helsinki Accords and all of those things. So, it's useful. We have a real difference of opinion between people on the right wing of the Republican Party who foolishly think the UN is a danger or at least an irrelevance, whereas in fact it's a lever to be manipulated like anybody else. So, our experience of multilateralism is not new. It's not Asia-based. It's complicated in the sense that we were so big in 1946, where we had something like 60% of aggregated GDP of the whole world with 4% of the population. Is a moment of ascendance that will never be reached again. And the end of the Cold War was something like that. It was 32% of aggregated GDP with 5% of the population. But since then, we've either slipped, depending on your point of view, or others have arisen. It's like the old physics problem, where you're in the stationary train, the train next to you is moving. Who's actually moving? So we've continued to grow well, by and large. We're a ruthless country with our own labor economics. We just discard people if they don't matter and remain competitive that way. But, others are rising, and it was inevitable. And one of the things that's very interesting that I make a point of saying is to Chinese and others as well, saying, what other great power deliberately gave a competitive advantage by bringing people into the world trading system? Right? I mean, if we were really interested in denying China its place in the sun, which they will say, then we would never have done that, right? And there's no answer to that point because it's true. And it's actually true in the sense that there's no other system you can think of in world politics where that's happened. You can argue that the British brought the Germans into, the liberal international trade model before the Great War. But it's an interesting point anyway. So multilateralism, in a more security sense, I would argue that we're still really good at it, right? Even though we tend, as I suggested to you a bit earlier when I was discussing the Obama review of Afghan policy, this was happening largely in complete isolation of views of people who had people there on the ground taking daily risks. I mean, and it's not as if we say, oh, the Australians have nothing to offer. It's just that we don't think, right? Because we're the center of the universe, because Washington reinforces that attitude. If I have anything for which I'm grateful, it's to have lived in a small country and even to have served another small country government to get that perspective. I mean, it's important. And even if it's mostly phony, we say, well, after you, Mr. Prime Minister, we don't give a hoot. You do it, right? You don't say, we know everything. But that's not the American way. So the difference in the attitudes to Asia began to become apparent. And anytime you want to, we can begin to talk about what happened in the second Bush 43 administration. Because I'm so accustomed to saying Bush 41 and forgetting that Clinton came afterwards.
You were talking about, the policy issues that are at the edges rather than at the center. But some people have said that during Bush 43 that he did end up taking this moralistic tone, this black and white view of the world.
Well, that's the man. That's his thing. But again, I want to be clear about what I attempted to convey back then about this question of at the edges and central, which is that these are admirable things. We are not just Clausewitz and Henry Kissinger. We are not just a country as a result of our past, City on the Hill, Woodrow Wilson, all of those things. We think that foreign policy, the security policy of the United States has to have more of a goal and objective than just the maintenance of our power. There's an old Yale drinking song called We're Here Because We're Here, Because We're Here, Because We're Here. Is that the reason? Well, if you're kind of strictly Clausewitzian, in your thinking, maintenance of our power is the purpose, and it's the primary purpose. But the primary purpose serves another one, which is with those relationships, with that influence, you're able to say to people like Suharto, and it happens every day, say, look, we're not going to make you lose face, but it would help us a lot in our own struggles to help you within the Washington bureaucracy to, do this or do that. And so in a very modest way, I had the chance to do that in Asia and three or four different countries and make a little difference that way. It's not a hooray for me moment, but it was my little laboratory test of something that said, look, we have a pretty good relationship. I'm not formally the Assistant Secretary for Human Rights, but I care about these kind of things. And I wonder if in the context of this discussion, we could, maybe move it this way. And they're not expecting it from a defense official, right? They're expecting more talk about bombs and bullets and all of the grubby craft of that stuff. So I think it's something that we've lost sight of. Good diplomats know that you seize a moment. You're not predictable. And that's where I salute what Trump is doing. He's injecting an element of non-predictability. The question is, does he know the playing field? And the answer is no. Anyhow, sorry, I don't need to get into that stuff. So it's a matter of Asia. I guess there's another point that's really important to mention is that we forget ourselves, let alone forget to mention to the Asians, that we needed no pivot or rebalance. All we needed to do was say, you got a problem with what we're doing? We've been out in the Western Pacific really since the 19th century. The first official aid memoir, Diplo speak for talking to other countries, which of course then were primarily in Europe. Well, from the young American Republic was about access to the Far East. So it's been in the DNA of our statecraft for a long time. And especially in the 19th century, Commodore Perry, 1900, Open Door, Second World War. We're still in the place we were when the Second World War ended. In other words, it's part of what we do. We don't have to come up with some new, initiative or something to describe it. I always feel that's a mistake. You just say, because firstly, what's what's provocative about doing what we've already done and with which they've already lived. So it's a matter of stressing the continuities and speaking softly and not trumpeting a pivot. I mean, with great respect to President Obama, who has very good instincts in many ways, particularly not doing stupid things, right? Avoiding more pointless, endless wars. There was no need to describe it as pivot. That seems to have been devised not by the State Department, but by the White House, which wanted to cast the president in statement like, toga, where it wasn't needed. And it certainly gave the Chinese a talking point. Why? Because suddenly, you see the Americans? If we don't understand that stuff, we're in trouble. We used to understand it very well. And you know what it's called? It's called being quiet, letting your actions speak louder than words, relying on statecraft before immediately going to talking about kinetic, which is the buzzword, bombing somebody or sending an aircraft carrier group. Sometimes it's needed. And then also not being predictable, just doing things. One fine day, everything's fine, and we'll send 5 airplanes flying into the South China Sea. But, it's not a provocation, it's what we do.
I want to talk now more about the second Bush 43 administration, and then of course you joined in 2007.
Yeah.
But if you remember in President Bush's second inaugural address, he talked about democratization, state building, democracy, stuff that he had said in his first campaign that he wasn't going to touch. What do you make of that? And to what extent was that, in fact, continuity or discontinuity? And how much did that pick up from the Clinton administration?
Well, I think that kind of appeal is in our DNA, certainly ever since Woodrow Wilson. But the second book I did, which was very well reviewed and sank without a trace after selling 1,000 copies. A British friend and I wrote it, but we basically pointed out that the experience of the American Republic, mostly, even now, prior to the Second World War and the Cold War, was in a balance of power world where it had to think about other powers out there and what might happen. I mean, we nearly were in hostilities with Britain in 1895 over Venezuela. Everybody forgets this now. But it was a world of powers, right? And so what happened with the Second World War, a global war in which, if there was ever a good war that had to be won, it was against the fascists. And then afterwards, global contest with the Russians meant that we felt all of these things, which are both talking points against a obviously illiberal, cruel, tyrannical, oppressive regime in Russia and elsewhere, also were part of what we were in business for. And that didn't stop with the end of the Cold War. History didn't stop. It just continued. Military spending continued. The range of things that were seen to be central to American foreign policy continued and were added on. We talked about this earlier. So I think that was there, and it wasn't just owned by the Democrats, right? And then President George W. Bush, is a profoundly moral guy. I mean, not for him the scandals of a personal nature that Bill Clinton had, just wasn't there. Is a believer in a higher spiritual being. He also did some very important things that people tend to forget. Let me give you 2 examples. The president's special initiative on AIDS really has made a difference to tens of millions of lives around the world. That's him. It's not some bureaucrat saying, well, here's something you can do to look like a good guy, even though you don't care. He does care. Second, the Millennium Challenge Corporation, I think it's called the Millennium Challenge account, where he said, let's find a place where the right people, the right policies are in place or could be in place, where something could be done, because most foreign assistance aimed at radically accelerating growth and an improvement in people's material circumstances, most of it fails for all kinds of reasons that we can't get into now, but that was him. So, and there are other things out there, primary school education in this country, No Child Left Behind. I mean, it has flaws, but it's not as if this guy was just a war president or was unbalanced by 9/11. he had his agenda, and most of it was very honorable. So to get back to the second inaugural, and you reminded me of that. I can't say I paid much attention at the time. Democracy is as American as apple pie, democracy promotion. We feel we have to dress up in everything we do with democracy promotion. It gets in the way sometimes because what we're really looking at is, I think, more participatory systems and less a particular form. We get excited about elections, where often elections are divisive. There's a foreign minister of the former Yugoslavia who was asked by a naive journalist saying, well, what do you think the impending election, its impact is going to be? He said, not good. He said, elections have in the Balkans, he said, a rather mixed effect, meaning, of course, elections line up nationalist parties, line up ethnicities, and others, not always a great thing. And sometimes countries choose, like Malaysia, to have ethnically defined political parties, which you might argue aren't seen as very good news either. So that's the context, at least as I see it, very incompletely and maybe a little too cynically. I don't think that it was in play much in our thinking about Asia. But remember, we had a president, we have an executive branch which has to pay attention to the law of people like Senator Patrick Leahy, which is if there's a coup d'etat, you overturn a democratically elected government, no more assistance. And we have similar laws like that which say we'll take away money for you if you trade in endangered, penguins or something. So there's a whole cluster of things out there, but a lot of them don't come to mind as very Asia related, at least in what I did. It's a money question, it's a trade question, it's a military capabilities question, and it's a pre-existing alliance question too. But the situation, even when I was at the Pentagon, which is getting to be, 8 years ago, is not one of dealing with all defense alliances, like the countries with which right now we have some rather not poor, but mediocre relationships are Thailand and the Philippines. Those are the two Southeast Asian countries we have formal security relationships with. The others, Japan and Australia, much stronger and arguably much more important. So that was also changing during the period we're describing, where the Philippines just didn't figure as much, and they were also always wanting our help in dealing with their southern problem, which involves Muslims, which of course fed into the global war on terrorism, and it was nice and convenient to have a Southeast Asian poster child of the war on terror and so on, whereas it was really part of the incomplete nature of state consolidation in the Philippines ever since the Americans left.
I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you just said, the weakening alliances with Thailand and the Philippines, and the continuingly strong alliances with Australia and Japan. What was driving that?
Sure. Philippines is capability, preoccupation with domestic insurgency, the way in which it became defense relationships with the Philippines became one of saying, well, what can we do to help the Filipinos win the war against Abu Sayyaf and jihadi, terrorist-minded people who are often just gangsters and money exploiting. And, it's complicated. It isn't just, the discipline of the Islamic State is 10,000 times greater than much of the Philippine, jihadi-minded terrorists, just for reasons that you and I both know. In Thailand, it was the coup against Thaksin's government. And then, of course, Thaksin was hardly an exemplar of civic behavior. He did a lot of damage. He undid achievements that the late king had achieved in South Thailand, where there's this, sense of being marginalized by the four southern provinces. And so the government that came in was military supported, but that meant that we were obliged by law to have nothing to do with them. I made a point, and it's not a big deal, it was just they would have people come visit Washington, like the chief of staff of their army and some other people would come. And people in the State Department wouldn't see them, right? We'll telegraph our disdain for this non-democratic government. But my view, usually, not always, but usually is these are exactly the times you stay in touch. So they'd come over and I gave a half-day tour of the Pentagon where the plane had hit 9/11. Kind of a waste of time in some ways, but important for the personal side of things. It's really important, as you know, in Asia to keep the contacts up, to always be gracious and respectful, never have rows. Some of the things that we tend to forget. We're policy driven, policy prioritized, whereas arguably the best thing to do is country and people prioritization, contacts, guanxi, as the Chinese say, and to try and do it that way. So I think that those two countries were, in that particular time, running into problems. Thaksin, the Leahy Amendment, the slowing down of the Thai economy, the Thais making their own decisions to buy stuff from China, military equipment, armored personnel carriers, various things, to not take a position in the South China Sea. That's something that's continued to now. And the Philippines, because of internal distractions. Now, Philippines began in recent years to really improve its economic performance under a comparatively good president, Nonoy Aquino. But now, we're in this strange place where really we're going to have to rely less on any kind of public diplomacy. In fact, the less said, the better, and more on the fact that, it's an important point and it's an important point about what our whole discussion today is that there's a logic to a situation. And, I don't know if you've ever read any of Evelyn Goh's stuff. She's really good. She gets it more than any other writer that I know. From Singapore originally, went to Oxford, or was it Cambridge? I forget. But very good, is now at ANU, I think. But she understands the dynamic in Southeast Asia, which is that having a balance and an equilibrium enables smaller countries to have room for maneuver. And so in some ways, we're needed, not because they love us, not because we're democracy, because of Hollywood movies, anything, but because the logic of the situation, which is to maximize your freedom of maneuver, requires other players, right? That's why we shouldn't be spooked by the Russians steaming down along the Western Pacific. So what? They have a quasi-alliance relationship with Vietnam. They're close to India. And all of it by itself, including they're now having, we hope, a better policy with Japan, means that's a balancing factor too, that the Chinese can't take things for granted. Not because we want to beat the Chinese up, but because it's a way to stabilize contention. So anyhow, those were some of the things that were in place, whereas interest-based connectivity in Southeast Asia really grew up. And that was what we were able to play with in 07, 08, which was, it was obvious that interests converged. And so, yes, Indonesia's a non-aligned movement and neither East nor West or whatever, but we're maritime, they're world traders, we're world traders. They know us very well. They don't have to sign on and be a treaty partner. We don't want them to be, and they don't want to be. But the interest converged. Similarly with Malaysia, right? Mahathir was a person of slogans, talking about non-aligned movement. The Americans are always, neo-colonial. But in an expanding economy, despite policies that wasted a lot of money in this country, just put it mildly, he could still, as it were, get away with it because he never really killed the golden goose. To kill the golden goose would be to strangle the trading economy. Here's a fact for you. What percentage of the total receipts of the British Empire in 1924, that includes British India, everywhere, South Africa, did British Malaya account for? 60%. Tin and rubber before the Great Depression. In other words, it's always been part of the world trading economy. Malaya, then Malaysia's a creation. Yeah, you can say the British, but it's the world trading economy. So that is the reason why people take, interest in Malaysia, why despite all of their self-inflicted problems, which include now the 1MNB and crazy things with Bank Bumiputra when I was a correspondent there and all that, that's a sideshow. The main thing is it's a big money generator. So, and Indonesia as well. So receptive to direct foreign investment, interest in the balancing impact of the United States, as long as we don't talk in terms that will anger the Chinese or anybody else. That's interest-based cooperation that actually has a far bigger foundation, as I'm attempting to explain, than the security alliance-based thing, because there's no automatic identity of view just because we have a security agreement. Now, you asked about Japan and Australia. Japan, it is the most important alliance relationship we have in the world. It anchors Japan to a friendly, benign, maritime offshore power. So the point that I mentioned to you about the logic of the situation, the logic of Japan's geographical and political position points toward a friendly external power, right? They had it with the British for 20 years, people forget, 1902 to 22. And they have it with us. And that's the biggest reason why the Chinese really don't want us to leave the Western Pacific. They want us to make room for them, but they know very well what they'd be dealing with if Japan suddenly decided they didn't want to have the United States in play, which is a lot of negative consequence. So Japan being anchored to us is the most important single benefit of the American forward presence in Southeast Asia, in all along Asia. With Australia, it's more, still sparsely populated, continental-sized place, still thinks of itself as primarily, I won't say a white country, but a kind of European-type country, despite the changing nature of migration. And deep historical memory to the fact the U.S. stepped in after Winston Churchill stupidly sent off 2 battleships off Malaya without air cover, and they were sunk. So Australia has come to think of the United States automatically as its best friend, with some consternation in recent years because of, people knew that the approach we were taking in the global war on terror was probably not going to lead anywhere, to a sense that, such as the review of the Afghan war in 2009, that we weren't really listening to our ally, which, by the way, has the highest deployment rate of any Western armed force in the world. 50% of all personnel in the Australian Army were deployed abroad about 3 or 4 years ago. So that's huge. And a sense led by a guy called Hugh White. Have you heard the name? Yeah. That, the Americans just can't manage the rebalance strategy, and that Australia shouldn't be hostage to the American overreach in attempting to constrain or contain China. But I think there's a long way to go before that becomes a geopolitical fact. And I think that, that continues to be an immensely significant alliance relationship. And unlike, the Filipinos, they hardly count in a kind of serious, major sense. And the Thais even as well, it has the largest number of generals per enlisted men of any army in the world. I think in the 1990, they had 600 generals. Wow. Yeah, so you'd have to ask. Plus, they've been very clever. They haven't gotten involved in wars, but the corollary to that is if you haven't been involved in wars, you don't have to fight them. And so if you have to fight them, are you going to rely on the Royal Thai Army to be innovative and courageous and take risks? I don't think so. Whereas, the other countries do know how to do their stuff. So it's complicated. I mentioned earlier that the Chinese last fought a war in '79. And were hammered. And that's the problem, that they remember it. And in 1980, when they cleared some islands of Vietnamese, they were very cruel. I've sort of forgotten where the question was.
No, it's just about the different
the different alliances. Different alliances, yeah. I mean, we began in 07, 08 to listen to the countries. Remember you talked about the countries, and I said, yeah, but you got to remember we had good people serving as ambassadors, and they were arguing for recalibrating again. But in this case, it really was listening to Malaysians, Vietnamese, and the Indonesians in particular. And with support from Secretary Gates and Undersecretary Edelman, we began to prepare a set of kind of bilateral strategic talks with these countries. And I have to be, a little careful about not explaining too much of them, but they were in answer to those countries' willingness to talk to us about the strategic landscape, in which, when we did have these meetings, some of which, in fact, all of which have become institutionalized since, we're dealing with the regional environment. And how can any discussion of the regional environment occur without mentioning China? It's just impossible. In fact, my job as Deputy Assistant Secretary for South and Southeast Asia and Australia was really easy. I would just go in there and say, "So, what's going on?" I go, what are they up to? I say, "Well, I don't know. What do you think?" Or they would take an interest in some of the publications I mentioned to you, like the annual report on Chinese military power, and took them more into our council about those sort of questions. In other words, really began to widen the bilateral connectivity to beyond just tactical and mill-to-mill stuff, but to saying, how can we be kind of more on the ball and helpful to you in ways, that kind of thing, that we're also going to do anyway. How can we take a planned event and make it rebound to your benefit?
Were you able to follow through with that stuff?
Yeah. I mean, to the extent that I can look back on some things, that's pretty much, I won't say pretty much it. There are some other things too. But and again, we were reacting to contacts that we had both via the structure, national security councils in these particular countries, because foreign ministry tended to be kind of locked in old ways of thinking, like the Malaysian foreign ministries, in many ways like the Indian foreign ministry, kind of latently anti-American, just out of habit. In Indonesia, the foreign ministry is far more proactive, Deplu they call it. They're much more effective. But again, in this kind of non-aligned movement, time warp thing. So it took kind of a positive response from the top of political leadership in these countries to say, no, we really need to begin to talk about things that are going on in the neighborhood and you're not around, right? Remember, it's always with Southeast Asia, it's always, there's too much of you or too little of you. And I was, you'll appreciate this, I was giving a talk to Singapore sometime. I was at the NUS, or I've forgotten, or one of Tony Tan's outfits, or Tommy Coe, I forgot. It was a number of years ago, but I think something like that. But I said, I've just come from a meeting where a senior member of the government of Singapore is saying, why aren't you sending many people out here you don't love us anymore, And I said, look, we had 100 star-ranked officers or more visit the city-state last year, whenever it was, 07, 06, 08. I said, secondly, they all come and get your medal, whatever it is, the Grand Order or the Flaming Peacock or whatever the hell it is. And they'll fly and come because the military love all this stuff. And I said, you know what you guys are like? I said, you're like the first girlfriend you have at high school. They went, what? What are you talking about? And I said, the girlfriend will say, do you love me? And you'll say, sure I do. And then the girlfriend says, you're just saying that. And they loved it because it's true, There's never enough. And then, but you're doing too much. I'll never forget the time I was at Georgetown at the time doing, I think I'd just taken the professorship, and that's what I did, because we had this thing where we'd sent the first one carrier and then the second to Taiwan after the missile display by the Chinese, and must have been 96, right? And we had a meeting in Thailand, and I was with Sandy Kristoff, who was National Security Advisor for Asia for Bill Clinton. And I just happened to be there. I wasn't part of the government. She said, come along, we need one more American rear end to put in the seat. So we're there, and together the Thais, and they were very eminent Thais. One became foreign minister later, one became a director general of the World Trade Organization. I forget the guy's name, but they were saying, you Americans are so provocative. sending the aircraft carriers, not one, but two. So you have to be careful. The Chinese, they'll lose face, and you're so provocative and adventurous. And at coffee, every one of them made a point of going to there were only four of us there, saying, doing the right thing, Lyle. I said, okay. But you know what I'm saying? You have to work at those levels. The public side of it, friends forever, good friends. Private side, no bad thing that you showed them that you're still able to do that. So I've forgotten exactly the point, but it was this question of dealing with a receptive environment where they wanted us to be there. And the reasons they want us to be there is what I call the logic of the situation. And the logic of the situation is, I've just never been able to get away from Hans Morgenthau and the balance of power, which is, it isn't the only thing, not by a long shot, but it is central, right? And the best diplomacy comes in how creatively you augment that principle with saving political prisoners or saving the rare spotted eagle in Borneo or whatever's on your mind, but not making those things the be-all and end-all of our policy and acting as if, the security dimension is just one of a number of things we do. But unfortunately, that's the mentality that took root in the State Department often, because they have all these bureaus and divisions: human rights, environment, governance, gender, religious liberty. And everyone, of course, is fighting for space for the secretary. And so, then, political, what they call Paul Mill or national security thing, that's just one of many things that we'll fund. No, that's the key thing, right? But if you argue that way, you're seen as a kind of militarist or, So that thing of dealing with these countries, and others we did as well, but the ones where the interests were really converging, again, the logic of the situation, not us. All we did was respond a little belatedly to their saying, where are you? Now, one of the kickers for that was the January 2007 ASAT, anti-satellite tests that the Chinese did, which blew up below the satellite. So the kinetic force went bang up, which scattered gazillions of particle debris in orbit, which has been a problem for people who deal with outer space ever since. In other words, it was vandalism. Vandalism. It was an incredible thing for them to do. And nobody knew whether the PLA had done it, or the Rocket Force, or whatever the hell they're called, had done it without being in touch with Hu Jintao, or whether they had and he didn't get the full briefing, or he got the full briefing and didn't care, which was a bad sign. Nobody knew, right? And like my first kind of day on the job, I joined people a lot more senior than I, and we were receiving that week 2 or 3 really senior guys, can't say who, but they came in and said, the first thing they'd say was, can you tell us what the hell's going on with the Chinese? Why do they do this? It was one of the reasons why later, and all this is in the public record, we brought down our own satellite and did it in a way that was significantly better, qualitatively better. Firstly, the actual act of destruction was downward kinetic thing, so it pushed everything in to be burned up in the atmosphere. It was announced ahead of time, according to constitutional order, and therefore by being announced ahead of time, we ran the risk of failure if the thing didn't work. But it all held together. And that's how diplomacy is conducted too. We didn't have to say, this is about you, China, and go like this. It's about, here's a way to do this. So that was part of that time too. So coming in at that second Bush 43 administration was a time where in this particular area, which was getting back up to speed in Southeast Asia in a military and security sense, was enabled, but at the strategic level. We had a lot of connectivity with Pacific Command, PACOM, at the tactical level. And that's been in place for a long time with many countries out there. It was just the question of the Chinese dimension and making sure that the American side heard what was on these people's minds. Now, there's a point here for Singapore, which I and a number of colleagues, we ran the risk of irritating some of our friends in Singapore. And that was to be able to say, well, we don't think you're the only, and certainly maybe sometimes not even the best voice of Southeast Asians. And there was this habit of saying all of these wonderful English-speaking Singaporean diplomats with their double firsts from Cambridge and all the rest of it. Yeah, we're smart. We love you guys. You talk. You're very, very interesting. You're far more interesting dinner party conversation than, say, with the Indonesians or the Malaysians. But it doesn't mean you know everything. So we had one of those interesting moments. Can't get into more detail than that. But there was a bit of scratchiness because we were saying, you know what? Through our contacts with the Malaysians and the Indonesians, which, as you know, was hot button stuff for Singapore, we said, we're learning a lot more from them than we are from you. Well, that was a shock. That was a shock. But it was true at that particular time. It didn't mean that we thought, Singapore was rubbish. No. But it was like, don't believe your own propaganda that you know everything. So that was an interesting moment.
So in terms of how much attention you were able to draw to the situation in South and Southeast Asia versus everything else that demanded the time of the Secretary for Defense, say, or even the cabinet in general, do you feel that your part of it got the attention that it deserved?
Look, it's a very big bureaucracy, and I was lucky to have a really excellent defense secretary, really excellent undersecretary, and they were distracted by, as I said, these two interminable wars. So it meant that as long as I didn't go in and do something catastrophically stupid, that I kind of had a comparatively free and open field in which to work. So that was very permissive for me. So I think that anybody in that position, unless he turned off the telephone, so to speak, would have tried to be responsive to what we were hearing from the Southeast Asian countries, saying, hey, can we hear a little bit more from you? And then to, respect them by saying, and then we did with a number of other visits, by saying, what do you people think is going on? Now remember, contrast it to the most egregious example of where we didn't seem to care at all, which is the 2009 Afghan review, where we had real allies in the game with lives at stake, and we don't ask their opinion. Now, we did, of course, but I'm just saying the whole temperament was very unipolar, which is, and so that was just adjusting the way we did things. With the Vietnamese, it was more part of this ongoing thing with normalization. And the Vietnamese, of course, with their 2,000-year history with China, where in some Chinese dialects, Vietnam, do you know the name for it? Renegade province. Which you normally hear about Taiwan, but it's renegade province for Vietnam, The word that the Vietnamese, when they're drinking too much, will use for China is locust nation. I mean, these are real facts, so we don't deal in that. We can talk about it in a lighthearted mood, and we never do in statecraft, but it's interesting. So we were listening. We were able to do these things. And then another thing happened, too, is that Secretary Gates in 2008 was expected, as he normally does at the Shangri-La conference, to give the opening address, which is very important for us because Singapore picks up the cost of this. John Chipman's out there and he sits in front and talks a lot about the situation, but it's a Singapore-funded, organized conference. It has to be alert to Singaporean sensitivities. It's very important. It's the Pan-Asia Defense Ministers meeting, right? Just like Europe has one too. And in 2008, we were asked to, write the speech. And it was time then, it was way past time, to mention the South China Sea, the words South China Sea, which had not been mentioned in American official talks about the regional environment. I mean, it might have been in passing, but to say, and we have a problem now in the South China Sea, that had not been done since Assistant Secretary Zhou Nai back in 1996, when the Chinese went to Mischief Reef off the Philippines and stayed and built structures that they intend to build in Scarborough and elsewhere. So the attitude had been, let sleeping dogs lie. don't get involved in things which are in a multiple way disputed or multifaceted way disputed, other claimant countries. And we have an important bilateral relationship with China. And why fan the flames? But that was a balance that had to be made, and the secretary read the speech, and the other words that the speech contained, which still remain in play as a kind of strapline, is the quote, "The United States is a resident power in Asia." Resident power. It doesn't mean going to Changi. It means Guam, and it means the Aleutian. So by a stretch, geographically, there we are, Saipan and those other islands. But that's the phrase, we're resident. And if you're a resident power in Asia, you have interests, right? So it was as a device, as a rhetorical device, it's important because it's saying we're not the outsider coming in making mischief, which of course is the Chinese talking point. Everything would be fine if you just didn't meddle. The pivot is just meddling. That's why we should never have called it that, because we gave them the talking points. The best thing to do was to say, well, we're just doing what we always do at the invitation of friendly countries.
So was that your contribution?
Well, yeah, but again, it's, whoever's watching this, yes, but, it had to clear a lot of hurdles, and it meant the other people agreeing to it accepted it. I mean, we did have some intra-agency disagreement, but it was time to do it, and it's very gratifying to see these are small things. I mean, what's a life? We're here but a brief time, and you wonder, will any of it stick? But that was picked up by people like Jake Sullivan and Kirk Campbell, Jeff Bader, and it was probably, and this is the point to make, really one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you, is that bipartisan attitude, right, towards the need to show that we're paying attention. Now, however you define that, it's another matter, was probably the best example of the bipartisan handover from Bush 43 to the Obama administration. And I think the degree of respect that those of us who were Asia-focused policymakers in the last Bush administration have for people like Campbell and all the rest, very, very high, right? And that's not the case in lots of issues. Syria is a catfight. Middle East is a huge catfight. How we deal with Europe, fight Russia. But that was real, and they all were very good to point to the fact that there was a lead up, a handover, a build up, a precursor to it. And so at that speech at Shangri-La, after Gates had made the speech, Global Commons, South China Sea, assertive behavior, making things more difficult, resident power in Asia, those things. The first person to stand up at the plenary meeting, right in front of a row of 5 PLA generals, was Kirk Campbell. And he got up and said something that almost brought tears to our eyes. It was, he said, "Mr. Secretary," he said, "I just want to thank you. Your speech could have been written by any of us." Diplomacy is about how you telegraph things. And right then at that moment, we telegraphed that. Bipartisanship, enduring interests, careful, calibrated language, but clarity about where we were. And that's why it was great fun. I mean, it was just an amazing time to be able to do that. And, to feel that you contribute, however modestly, to the country's history is, how many of us get that chance?
You had talked about, a large part of that second administration was just driven by the logic of the situation. But how much of it was also driven by personalities, by the fact that you have this, not only a convergence of interests, but also a convergence of people?
Well, remember we had the aftermath of the sense that we'd rather gone overboard in the first administration. The counterterrorist thing was either, didn't need to be stressed so much just because of the blowback, the boomerang effect, and also because we were kind of in place and it was part of the landscape, part of the equipment. And then partly, really fine, Secretary Gates, busy as he was, is from that school, which is, he worked very, very hard to work with China to begin strategic dialogues with that country. And to say, look, what we did with the Russians beginning back in the early 80s, we need to do with you. And it ran into resistance. Not resistance because they hate us, but resistance for internal bureaucratic sensitivity reasons. Well, which general are we going to see, and aren't we getting out of line, and has this been cleared with the Politburo and the Central Committee and all of that stuff. But it took a long time. It's better now, but he worked very, very hard, so you can see his mentality, right? And I think one of the disappointing things of his book, the book with the title Duty, for me was that he didn't talk about Asia at all, which also shows how he was completely distracted by trying to get the executive branch to kind of get sensible about the Afghan wars and the Iraqi winding down and all the rest of it. And kind of in an implicit way shows how there was room for us to work on the rebalance question with our Asian friends. And I was brought in for India mainly, because that's what I'd done academically more than anything else. And to do that, and to kind of see if we could not push the fast forward button and do the things that we should have been doing in the first, Bush administration, or even the latter Clinton period, where we're all obsessed by global issues, by trying to put the nuclear genie back in the box, and all of these worthy things which weren't really grounded in the balance of power attitude. So your question's a really good one, the personalities, and they were by and large very good. I mean, I have to be clear in saying, as a group, I wasn't always impressed with the State Department, either by the political appointees in some places or by some of the long-serving people who couldn't. I mean, they just don't like the fact that OSD in the Pentagon makes an awful lot of American policy. And they like being, it's just a normal thing. I'm ambassador, I'll set the policy to Malaysia or Indonesia, and we go, well, actually, no. And so there was always this, as they always say, the hardest part of foreign policy right here in this city. You're always bumping heads and having these terrible fights, and then you come home exhausted, and then you haven't even told the other country what you're going to do because it's so tiring. So Gates, I would say, Edelman, the undersecretary, Shin, the assistant secretary, some good people by and large at the White House, although they did get in the way over one particular thing, which was, what the TAC is, the TAC, Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. Mm-hmm. This became the kind of, Metro card so that you could get on the train and go have your global talks with the Asian leaders. I forget what it's called, because there's so many acronyms in Asia, but there's like the East Asia group or something. In other words,
Asian community, maybe?
No, it's not East Asian community. It's like a set of talks that ASEAN has with Japan, China, and Korea.
3.
What? Yeah, something. ASEAN plus 3. That's it. The ASEAN plus 3, or that type of thing. And every country had to kind of sign on to the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. And if you didn't do that, the Chinese were very happy to have us not signing on forever, because we'd exclude ourselves. In other words, we were self-marginalizing ourselves, which is the most irritating thing when you see what we need to do, and we're marginalizing ourselves because one or two people at the NSC said, no, don't sign that thing. I said, everybody signed it. No, don't sign it. But I said, the Australians have signed it. I said, it looks like a late night cable show television ad. It says, this offer not applicable in Nevada, Ohio, blah, 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 blah. So the Australians said, it was just a one-page thing saying, Australia hereby exceeds the tenets of the TAC. This has no effect or bearing on our security relations, our bilateral things, blah, 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 which airlines we choose, blah, 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 blah. Bang. And I said, everybody but us has done it. Here are all the caveats, the exemption clauses. What's the problem? And the answer was ill-informed. It was, if you sign it, the Burmese are in ASEAN as well, and there's a non-interference clause in the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, which they'll use against us. I said, no, they won't, because they'll have to clear all that with the rest of the ASEAN countries, and no one's going to get in our way over that, right? And already we were at that time, after Cyclone Nargis, we'd begun the first mill-to-mill talks with them. We had a wonderful moment with Admiral Keating. Tim Keating was PACOM commander, 4-star, standing on the tarmac of the Rangoon Military Air Force, or Military Air Base. In the bay is a flotilla of 25 ships full of relief supplies. The Burmese had no idea what to do with us, including, a lot of American supply ships look like aircraft carriers because they can carry helicopters and they have flat decks and everything. And here we were, and they had people dying of, exposure and terrible mess. Nargis was a really big disaster. And so it was one of those moments psychologically in diplomacy, kind of like the moment that the Chinese had over Kaohsiung in 96, which is after that, nothing would quite be the same again. And, and they were, remember, for 50 years, they were saying the United States is an interfering country, and if the American military gets close, they're going to invade us. So here we were with this ship full of stuff. So again, it was an example of where the times enabled us to kind of push the fast forward button. And there were other things like that too. But we still ran into problems. The problem about training with Indonesian special forces. But part of that's just Washington stuff. Senators are like petty, power brokers and stuff. They just love to preserve their power. And that's really what it's often about. They'll say it's about the principle, but the idea is that we will go ahead and do this with the Indonesians because we need to, right? No, there's a principle there. You don't deal with people who, as a unit, participated in what might have been war crimes. That was then, this is now. So it's just a difference in point of view. But my view is, if you want to make a difference, you deal with people. You don't erect a wall. There's lots of room quietly without microphones or the cameras to do things. And this is one of the real problems with our conduct of our statecraft, is this desire to look virtuous and to set the pace and to, insist on people doing it our way. Whereas our way matters less than an outcome that is in accord with our interests. So I probably sound very kind of liberal and also very conservative at the same time.
Actually, you do. but I'm curious to know if you could talk more about the differences of opinion. You say with the State Department, for instance. What were some of those disagreements? Well,
let me try to avoid personality, because I know and respect all these people and like them. So I'm disinclined to kind of say, well, this particular person was difficult in a particular situation, even though it's true. Because remember, these things aren't just about people. They're kind of institutionally and about what you run into and how you navigate it without losing your position. There was a question of, the Sri Lankans were fighting a very tenacious terrorist enemy, right? No quarter. None of our American Navy people have ever been on boats that I know of where 12 suicide fast attack craft are coming at them with explosive charges in the bow, so that if even one of them gets through, that's the end of the ship. And so in other words, you have to kill them if they're coming at you that way. That's a pretty big stakes war. And, but we had a problem with, emigre communities who tended to be disproportionately Tamil, who correctly said this government of Sri Lanka is very tough and the human rights way, are abusive. And the answer is yes, right? So, but what do you do with that, right? Do you then say you're going to have no cooperation with them at all? Well, that's an example. We could either assist them in ways that I'm not permitted to talk about or not. And so that would be a point of contention, right? But we had, we pushed and prevailed, not over everything, but over a few things. But these were real life and death things. They weren't just nuances in a communique. Like, for example, the Sri Lankans kept asking us at the very end of the war for a type of gun. I forget what it was called, but it was a gun that would recognize instantly the place from which an artillery round was coming at the Sri Lankan army. And the reason that mattered was you could shoot back immediately, destroy that artillery piece without killing all of the IDPs, internally displaced people, that the Tamil Tigers had put around these encampments in order to have human shields. And yet we wouldn't do it because the rules said, well, you can't sell them more. I thought, well, wait a minute. We're complaining about them because they're killing civilians, and here's a way to not kill Sri Lankan civilians. You see what I'm saying? It became points of illogicality, if that's a word. So in other ways, there were issues with the NSC over this question of the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. State was with us on that one. There are other ones where, for example, trying to be cute, and I say that, advisedly, when we're looking at Chinese perceptions of the ways in which we're collaborating with our friends out there, right? The Chinese are always saying we're building up alliances and anti-China alliances. The answer to them, again, very nicely, because we have a lot in common with them, is to say, no, you're doing it. What you're doing is creating the things that you most fear. And you've been doing it since 2006. So why? So that's the answer to that. But we would have situations where, I've lost my thread. What was it? I've just lost my thread. I haven't had enough coffee.
Institutional.
Oh yeah, that's right. It was institutional questions of where people would kind of come in behind. Pacific Command, by and large, was on the ball. It's a penchant of American senior military people to always think that through military camaraderie, right, code of honor, he's a military guy, that they can somehow get to the bottom of things. I can't get into details, but very senior people here have felt that they could deal with very senior people in Pakistan and somehow get past what are rigid logic of the situation problems with them, which is they're always going to play a double and triple game with us. They do that because they're the weaker of the subcontinental powers and they leverage everything they have. Their approach is bad boy diplomacy, just like North Korea. But if you don't do this, it'll get a lot worse. We go, well, gosh, you've got nuclear weapons and maybe we better do what you say. But it doesn't engender much love for Pakistan. Whereas India, difficult foreign ministry in particular, but rising power where there's a natural identity of interests in the Pan-Asia region where they're growing power, where we want to be friends with them, where there's very few fundamental issues where we disagree. That's the power of the future. So it's that kind of complexity is irritating to some senior military people. And they'll say, wait a minute, I know this guy. I know this chief of staff of Pakistan. He's a good guy. I'll just go see him and we'll sort it out. Or again, I have to be careful with the names, but there was a particular issue with someone in Congress, and the very senior people from our department, very senior, went down there together with senior military to play a very important honor on this particular member of Congress, right? If you have people of that seniority coming to see you, seeing if we can get past a position, that's, in this town, big deal, right? You're paying homage at the court. They love it in Congress, right? So that happened, and there was two seniors, military, our people, and then two assistants. And they, after the meeting with this particular member of Congress, said, well, what do you think? Have we made any progress on this issue? And three of the four said, no, this guy's playing us. But the senior military guy said, no, I'll work this out. He did. So there's that issue, which I've noticed along the way, is really recurrent in our senior military, which is, I can work it out, I can get straight to the heart of the matter while all of you, guys at OSD and State Department and NSC are also clever. You're too clever by half, as the British say. So there's that. I'm thinking of the question of getting the South China Sea mentioned. That took a bit of doing for the 2008 Shangri-La thing, but it happened and was noticed, made a big difference. When I go to China later in other countries, they say, oh, you were there during that time. You were part of that. I said, yeah, well, we were. It was overdue. That was my view, overdue. And by not saying it, we're telegraphing that we're not being serious, we're not paying attention, and that we don't care, which of course we do. So how you define it is hard. So there was that. There was the question of, there was an interesting moment, which people watching this will find encouraging. That we were close to our first political military talks with the Vietnamese ever. It was October 2008. And we were working with them. And of course, it's a very delicate relationship here, and lethal weapons. Do we sell? Do we not? The Vietnam War, the old Politburo, how much the Vietnamese are talking to the Chinese, notwithstanding the fact that they're ancient enemies and all that stuff. So we were getting in the lead up to it, and then it was time for us to replace our defense attaché. So as a matter of normal meeting with ambassador, we said, the guy's name is, it was kind of like an Irish name. So he said, that's fine. I'm sorry, I've just blanked on that. I'll remember it in a moment. And so he went out there. He's a colonel, American Army colonel, Irish name. But the Irish name was given to a Vietnamese refugee kid when he'd come to the U.S. So here the Vietnamese were saying, we're getting a Viet Q, we're getting a Vietnamese, ethnic Vietnamese who speaks Vietnamese coming here as American defense attaché, as an American military guy. And then, of course, the ambassador had to sell this back home to, to people who aren't going to be well disposed. And he'd say, please, 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 can you withdraw the nomination? I said, no way, we're Americans. What are you talking about? Well, how about delay? No, delay not possible. Why are you being difficult? You don't really want the talks. I said, we do. It's your problem. So, and that, of course, you had everybody in our system because, we so are in love with ourselves with how hyphenated Americans we are, and everybody fits. We do this sometimes, I think, and again, with great respect to the particular people. I don't know if we should always send hyphenated Americans, say Korean Americans to Korea or Indian Americans to Delhi. I don't understand. I'm not saying no. I'm just saying, why are we trying to make a point, showing how wonderful and variegated we are? It doesn't work for the Indians very often. They think, well, come on. I've been in crazy situations with the Thais where we had a brilliant American ambassador, Will Ito, I-T-O-H. He's a good guy and is a Civil War buff, by the way. And he is a very senior State Department guy, and he was nominated as ambassador to Thailand. Well, at that meeting that I was telling you about where the Thais were talking about the Taiwan problem, they said, oh, why don't you send a real American? I said, what are you talking about? Like, we nearly folded the meeting at the time. People forget. So, and similarly, I'm glad that we have an inclusive attitude to all people, whatever your sexual preference is, blah, 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 all of that. I don't think it's the top of the list of what we should be doing. It's fine. But, to make a point by sending an avowedly, openly gay ambassador to a major country where that could get in the way of his duties, right? Not in the way of his judgment. I've got to be very clear what I'm saying here. But I just never understood the point of doing that, right? It just seems to me to be making things complex. I'm not saying don't send. I'm just saying in some places where, open advocacy and this kind of thing, why do we want people to see an American as a Black American? We don't. Why do we want to see people as an Indian? We don't. We want to see them as Americans. But at Georgetown, you must find this as a professor, the Indian Americans always say, well, here's my research topic. And I say, I don't have to look at it. I know what it is. No, you don't. It's Kashmir. How did you guess? I said, because I know that's what you're going to do. And then similarly, the Koreans come in. Here's my topic. I said, I know what it is. No, you don't. I said, I do. North Korea. How do you know? I said, here's the deal. You do India and you do Korea to the other ones, right? And of course, it was terribly unpopular for doing this. So what I'm saying is there's a kind of predictable quality. Some of these Korean Americans, Indian Americans, Pakistani Americans, whatever they are, aren't as smart as they think they are, right? And we say, oh, you must know India. Why? We're being racist. Because you're dark and you have an Indian last name, you get it? So what I'm saying is there's a little bit of stupidity in the way we do things. Not a little, a lot. But, it all works out in the end because we have the right message. I mean, you've got to really believe that because, statecraft is so terrible sometimes. You've got to say, well, notwithstanding we're on the side of the angels.
Now you mentioned PACOM a couple of times.
Yeah.
It's never been clear to me, talking to various people, what exactly, how much of Asia policy in particular, how is it coordinated in terms of PACOM?
Well, it is a lot. And it's always, I think long ago, there used to be a muscle man called Charles Atlas, and he talked about how do you build up your upper strength? He said dynamic tension. You know what dynamic tension was? This arm pushing against this arm as much as you can. That's dynamic tension. Well, it's dynamic tension with PACOM. They'd have a particular set of attitudes to China, to Chinese military intentions, to capabilities, to how we deal with a particular set of countries. But the formal structure is very clear. PACOM does not make defense policy for the United States. It, at the tactical level, carries it out. We have a country, the supremacy of civilians is sacrosanct, and it's mirrored in lots of ways. I mean, you know, I was a deputy assistant secretary. Nice, senior enough job, right? But it's not the biggest deal in the world. And we would have visits where we'd have defense ministers of very big countries come and visit. Well, we'd line up at the Pentagon grounds. They have the 21 gun salute and the bands and all the jazz. And the only person permitted to stand next to the deputy assistant secretaries was the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff. And the rest was behind us. So it's a visible protocol display of civilian supremacy. And people take it very seriously. Very seriously. And one of the most admirable things about our military is the way in which the culture of obedience is really built in. Of course, sometimes that gets to be kind of crazy rank consciousness, But, and in fact, I would sometimes say, well, we better listen to what you're saying, Professor Clad. I said, why? He said, well, you're a 3-star. I said, I beg your pardon? I mean, is this some kind of Hollywood reference, or what are you talking about? And he said, oh no, protocol, you're a 3-star general. I said, I am? I was halfway into my job before I even knew that. And I said, wait a minute, I thought it was my opinions, arguments. No, they're just saluting. That was really crazy. So PACOM, at the end of the day, is a tactical implementer of defense policy made by the administration and, of course, in particular, the Department of Defense and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. And several occasions traveling with people who were senior to me, we'd run into ambassadors and said, well, I don't think that approach is going to work. And they're not, this particular country isn't ready for the type of dialogue you're intending. And then not I, but my colleague, more senior, said, you don't seem to understand. You do not make the defense policy of the United States of America. We do. So there's a lot of that. The American government is like bumper cars. You're going bang, bang, bang into each other all the time. And it's remarkable how civil we remain. But it's, you've probably heard this example that OSD in the Pentagon is like the Department of State in the Pentagon. Mm-hmm. And the Bureau of Political Military Affairs in the State Department is like having the Pentagon in the State Department, if you follow me. So that's why, not surprisingly, we get on really well with the Pall Mill people at State. But they're, everybody's trying to do his or her job. And I think our problem is that we have, in answering our best instincts, which is not to have, Ivy League, white male, middle-aged elites running everything. So widening the participatory opportunities and also widening the array of things which we think of as the proper subjects of statecraft. We talked about it earlier: governance, women, green, trade in endangered species, all those things. Democracy, human rights, you can, more than the fingers you have on your hand. That those things are now part and parcel of the machinery of statecraft. There's bureaus, there's deputy assistant secretary. Well, all of that may reflect the world's needs, but it doesn't actually make for a very easy policy process. And there's an expression, for example, I worked a lot with South Asia, both in the job and before that. And there was a phrase I learned when they first created the South Asia Bureau at the State Department. And they said, it's a plaything of the functional bureaus. Do you understand what that means? South Asia Bureau, which is geographic, regional, sort of like East Asia Pacific or Europe or whatever. But South Asia as a standalone bureau is the plaything, meaning it's not really serious because the functional bureaus, child labor, governance, green, non-proliferation, they all have a part of South Asia, There's always worrisome things going on in South Asia. So that's what the expression was, plaything of the functional bureaus. So it tends to be often a big fight within state as who has the lead on a particular issue. So, and then we have this, the NSC, and under Obama, way too many people in it who are way too young and inexperienced, didn't know anything. And, we have a very cumbersome system. When the main players were PACOM for me, and then we had the problem, maybe you've run into this with talking to Armitage, of what we call the problem of the seams, SEAM, the seam between the combatant command, which is Pacific Command, and Central Command. And that's the Pakistan-India border. And I can't get into details, but there were a number of times where something was happening, where somebody forgot to tell us, and something was going on with the Pakistanis, and, nobody told the Indians, which is like the first rule of diplomacy. So more than once I had to pick up the phone and go, take a deep breath and say, oh, hello. Oh, you've noticed that, have you? I said, well, what is this doing in American double standards and double dealing and triple tongue? I said, no. It's the same thing that happens in your system, which is left hand, right hand. And we had no idea until today. And if you don't believe me, I'm sorry. I thought we had a better relationship, but that's the situation. And it happened 2 or 3 times. So this was a 1980s system for dividing military authority and control. And we may have to revisit that because that is really hard to get coherence in, a kind of American coherence, when you've got commanders of these regional commands who are almost like proconsuls. If you ever travel in the airplane that these guys have, the combatant commander of PACOM or Central Command, it's like traveling with a Saudi Arabian sheikh, big planes and stuff. You think, well, what does this do for your self-regard? Well, a lot, So they get tired of, tiresome, bureaucrats like me showing up saying, well, actually, no, you got to do it this way. So there's always that tension. But they're good, and the people at PACOM are really good. The head of the current Pacific Fleet, PAC Fleet, they call it, is an excellent guy called Swift. And then Admiral Harris, who's overall PACOM guy. Japanese-American, by the way. Really, really a good guy. And also sometimes the Chinese will say in very inappropriate ways, well, of course, he's very against China. Why? He said, well, because he had a Japanese mother. I say, don't talk like that. Not to me, anyway.
So more on PACOM, just out of curiosity, how is it that if there was that seam, DOD then went ahead and created this? I mean, you, for instance, you're South and Southeast Asia, so you cross that seam, right? Yeah. So how did that happen?
Well, no, it was a seam only in the sense that South and Southeast Asia is handled by different parts of state. Okay. There's a South Asia Bureau, right. And then there's the East Asia Pacific Bureau, right. Which includes Southeast Asia. Right. So that's an internal seam, okay. If you like, or a different geographical division, right. Within different parts of the American federal government. Right. And you'll find different attitudes in commerce and places where we didn't deal with very much Treasury. So how did I do it? Well, we had very, very good collaboration within APSA, Asia Pacific Security Affairs. So the designation was OSD stroke APSA, APSC. And in APSA, there were 3 deputy assistant secretaries. One for Central Asia, which meant Afghanistan, which meant we never saw him. It was a terrible, terrible job. Because, of course, that was where our, by and large, I'm being very blunt here, futile war was continuing and continues to right now. And then East Asia, which was China, Japan, Korea. So there was a lot of interaction with those guys. And we began to think multilaterally ourselves. So I would visit often at my own initiative, but I'd stop in Tokyo and see the defense minister, which was a pretty big deal for me. But they say, oh, there's Professor Clad, he knows India. Tell us more about India. So we were doing that kind of thing along the way. In other words, playing to our strengths, right? As long as I had the trust of the secretary and the undersecretary, I could do that, Can you imagine a Chinese senior bureaucrat saying, oh, I think I'll stop in this other country and tell them what we're doing elsewhere? What? That'd have to be like staffed out for 2 months. So we're flexible, and we think that way when we're not too self-regarding. So that, I don't know if I'm being very clear, but that habit of being able to think multilaterally, saying, is a growing thing in our country. If you want to talk about it in terms of, kind of national security talk, and think of it as kind of intermediate connectivity in Asia between countries like Vietnam and Malaysia, or, informally arrangements with Taiwan, or Japan having its own relationship with Burma. Every one of those things is net advantage to us. We don't have to be in the driver's seat. All right, everybody seat here and there, we'll drive. Less is more. It's time, our statecraft should become Buddhist. Less is more. The more we stand back, the more we gain. There was a particular moment where, and again, I can't mention names, but a very senior American was visiting India, and the advice was given to him after the briefing book, well, what else to say? And I said, well, it was me. I can't pretend it wasn't. Saying, well, don't get into the business of over-talking the relationship, right? Don't do what some people, there's a guy who was there for many years. He is always on TV, always writing for Foreign Affairs. Smart guy called Nick Burns. But, is that the way to talk about the India relationship? I said, just say, well, what can we do? Be fatalistic. So anyway, fast forward, the meeting happens. And this particular senior visiting American is speaking to the prime minister. And he says, so what's the future relationship? And, this guy said, our senior guy said, oh, I don't know. He said, what can we do, Mr. Prime Minister? We're fated to work together. Oh, well. And it was exactly the right tone to hit. And I saw all the Indians in the room going, sometimes we're too full of ourselves. And if you just keep it low, as I said, less is more. And that was what he said. He said, well, what can I do? What can we do, Mr. Prime Minister? We're fated to work together. Like, choice, no choice, we're stuck with you. Rather than saying, oh, if you're with us, we'll do this and we'll do that, it'll be great, and we're the two democracies, and blah, blah, blah. And the real problem is that kind of talk goes to our people's head. I think it went to people's heads like Madeleine Albright, that kind of thing. That's my principal complaint with the Clinton years. We were so full of ourselves, we kind of got up everybody's noses for being so self-righteous. And also very slow. Look how slow we were to normalize with Vietnam. Clinton sounding all the time. What does the wind feel like today? What is this? It was incredibly protracted. Whereas look what Obama did with Cuba. He just said, do it. Mind you, he did it at the end of his time, but he said, forget it. And guess what? The sky hasn't fallen in. Sun still comes up in the east. So we have all these hesitations. But we're on the right track, I think, even with the current president, and however that's going to work out. I think he's brought a potential welcome element of rediscovering unpredictability, right? And I remember he saying this early on in this long election year. It's now December, and this was in June or something. He said, a great power should never be completely predictable. I thought, right. You don't say very much that I think stands up, but that was right. And there are other things too. And that's the way to do it, as long as I say, and it's just, you've heard this from me already, obey the logic of the situation. Understand the logic of the situation pulls us in. Don't go in as if it's our territory. It pulls us in. They all want us to be there. quietly, effectively, recurrently, right? And as I say, do you love us? Yes. You're just saying that. Well, then don't answer. Just show up and do it, you know.
I don't know if this applies to your time in office, but I've certainly heard that in the first term of President Bush's administration, that there might have been an over-reliance on allies like Japan and in particular Australia when it comes to Southeast Asia to gather intelligence, to kind of do the heavy lifting.
Well, again, it's a question of whether the two countries themselves think we're expecting too much from them, or whether the countries with which they're working, the third-party countries, think that it should be us and rather not them, or that why are you sending the butler when you could come yourself, that kind of thing. I think that I'd never heard much to that effect. I think that there was a temptation to rely on the Australians as the kind of policemen of the South Pacific. That's it. And the reliable Australian diggers with their funny hats, and they'll show up in Australia. Reliable chaps, won't question the flow. And of course, the Australians are paying their premium for their insurance policy too. Plus, there's an affinity. You know, the Australian public thinks very much like people do here. Japan, I found the Japanese just very slow to take advantage at a certain political level of the need of the situation, which was India and Japan. I mean, they're just now really beginning to get into the groove of one another. I was at a dinner last night, 2 Japanese scholars, and they said, oh, it's just beginning. You know, there's no real feeling. Why can't we go ahead and build the Shinkansen railways or the shipyards? And everybody wants it. Why can't it happen? And so there's something missing. It's expensive. It involves debt finance. But, you know, if they want it to happen, it will happen. So with the Japanese, they, again, I think we're just kind of a little slow to get to the game. But I think in the last 7 or 8 years, look at Myanmar, look at India, look at Indonesia and some of those relationships. I think they're kind of back in the game now, more that they see it as pretty much a set-off with the Chinese. The Australians don't like to be in that position. Australians, I mean, the Japanese never say it's about constraining China, but when the Japanese go into Myanmar and do this and do that, and do something in Sri Lanka and all the rest of it, you're pretty sure they're there partly because the Chinese are there, or mostly. With the Australians, they don't like ever to describe their work as being part of an anti-China arrangement. The Japanese, you know, there's fewer illusions. And the Australians, like all people who are safe and comfortable and well off, want things to be good all times, good weather, bad weather. They want to have the cake and eat it too. That's hard. New Zealand, where I grew up, is even more that way. They want to sell dairy products forever. And then they say, if you think about great power rivalry, oh, the Chinese are just the Americans are very difficult and erratic and, you know, adventurous and risk takers. And so, you know, same thing. Well, it's not the same thing. And they know it. It's just they want to be safe and distant and make money. That's just life. So, I don't know, has this been a good run for you so far?
Yeah, I think this is great, yeah.
I'm just trying to think of anything that I may have neglected.
May I ask you one more question about PACOM?
Yeah, sure.
Just in terms, again, I've heard this more said of the first term and the second term, that there was perhaps an over-reliance on PACOM to gather intelligence. I mean, you say PACOM is an implementer, but there was some suggestion that maybe PACOM was being over-relied on for intelligence and sort of, you know, being in the advanced position.
Look, it's a DOD is huge. The military is huge. The combatant commands are huge. They have resources plus proximity to Asia, which is, you know, in the Washington bubble, it's good to have those people out there. But PACOM is also a big, unwieldy structure with a lot of divisions. There's J5 and J3 and all these different divisions that are related to mill-to-mill relationships to tactical involvement with exercises with a lot of friendly countries. And these things go way back, like Cobra Gold with the ties to the 60s or something. And then with the Malaysians, and a lot of these things are very, very important for military relationships, and also do things that lift capability and also enable us to understand how they work, and all of those things, which the Chinese are nowhere near as close. Want to be, probably will be over time, but that's not the end of the world. I think that PACOM, remember too, is kind of the visible standing assembly hall for all of these global services. Like we have Navy Intel, each of our branches has intelligence services. Navy Intel is the only one I ever knew anything about, and they're really good. So were they the people, vacuuming up all of this stuff? I don't think so. I really don't. I think it was just the 9/11 thing. 9/11 thing was like somebody grabbing the steering wheel and just going in the car, screech, and we careen, and luckily we don't crash, and we careen our way through the underbrush and eventually get back on the highway. But it's been a very dislocative thing, and also I think we've kind of marked time while competitors didn't. And that's the reason to keep things in perspective. As terrible as the things that happen in the Middle East are, they're not existential. Nor is Chinese challenge existential. But it is big, and it is comprehensive, and it is only one-way result, which is will either be squeezed out or diminished, right? And many people say, well, fine, so what? Let's have a G2 relationship. But I don't think the world works like that. I think it's a question of who's the subaltern, who takes the orders, who gives them. And I don't think it's ever that simple, and it would be insulting if we get into that mode again, the kind of crude, simplistic Cold War stuff. But it is true. Our national power is a reflection of many things. But without the security dimension, we'd have a much, much reduced voice. And that reduced voice would be missing altogether in big commercial transactions. It's, very well with your own experience. It's full spectrum. And we're taken seriously because of this stuff. So it was a wonderful chance to kind of serve. I don't know if I'd ever get the chance again. But, serving people who really understood it and were broadly at home with the perspective I've tried to develop for you was a seminal honor. And, one of the things that really makes the country great is that you have a chance to do that in this country. I mean, look at me. I was a foreign service officer for another country. How'd that happen? I had a lot of people ask me that. So it was, so the combatant commands, you're on to something, but it's something where, again, I was lucky to work in the area and at the time and with the issues that I had, so that I was pushing against an open door. I wasn't bumping into somebody and say, you can't go and talk with the Malaysians or the Vietnamese or the Indonesians because I'm the guy that does that. No, that never happened. Because we were adding a dimension to something that was already there. That's the best way to think of it. We called it a strategic dialogue, and the basic of it was, what's going on in the region that you're thinking about that we should hear? And that was the motivating idea. And by the way, that led to there was an interesting moment, and again, I can't be specific about the countries, but it'll show what happened. There was a particular country which had a very strong-willed American ambassador there, kind of dictatorial behavior, that type of thing, but a number of equities, medium-sized Southeast Asian countries, so use your imagination. This is, while I was still in the Pentagon, we were planning one of these set of talks with this particular mid-sized Southeast Asian country that would have this regional dimension to an already planned set of talks. So talks were going to be, say, 2 days. First day would be domestic stuff, how can we be helpful? And then first time you, medium-sized Asian country, can tell us what you think is going on in the region. Well, The American ambassador there said, no, they're not ready for it. Well, after Shangri-La, the Secretary of Defense went to this particular country and said, so is everything lined up for the talks tomorrow and the next day? And they said, oh, well, yeah, tomorrow the domestic stuff, but the other one, why not? What? Why not? Well, the ambassador says they're not ready for it. And I'm told, I have no idea, but I believe the story that when the next day the American ambassador showed up, the regional dimension of the talks had been reinstated and the American ambassador was physically barred from attending. That's big stuff. In Washington power games, chest thumping, that's a pretty big deal. So it shows you the way things work if they have to, if people aren't on board. And so that's now the world we're living in. 8 years later, that's what we do now routinely. And we have our Chinese friends to thank because their behavior has been, I think, almost incomprehensible. The only way it can be understood is through domestic politics in China, that this current leader needing to be on good terms with the military people and throwing any goodie and toy at them that he needs because he's incompletely consolidated with the party. But that's not good news for everybody else. I mean, there were situations where the Malaysians had contracted out. Am I going on too long? Do you want to say? Going on, they'd contracted out a seismological survey to some European firm, and they tow a number of things behind them when they survey the ocean floor below. People don't appreciate that the size of those sensors is the size of a football field. They tow behind them. And so this is Malaysian territorial sea, or exclusive economic zone stuff, 200 miles, but well down, below Brunei. And they're out towing, and the Chinese, not Navy, but they have something called the Maritime Marine Law Enforcement thing, where they have really big ships, but incompetent skippers. And this thing tried to cut the line and became enfouled and nearly capsized the Chinese ship. Just imagine that mess if that had happened. But what I'm saying is that the Malaysians take the view, what? Something happened? I don't, because they don't want to raise this issue. They're the first country to recognize the Chinese. They say, well, we're not in Vietnam or Philippines. We're way, way down in the South China Sea. But Chinese were taking the view, so what? That's within the 9 dotted line thing. And that never got any publicity. And even when I'd known it had happened and I'd be at a conference and I knew there were press there, local press, I said, well, and of course, just last week, the survey boat was hailed by the Chinese Maritime Police Force, and then there was interference and various things. Everyone goes, oh, no, nothing, because I was like speaking, how it is in Southeast Asia. Everyone goes, oh, is that right? No, next topic. So anyhow, I hope this has been of some use to you.
It has. Thank you so much. And you've been so generous with your time. I hope I didn't.
It's okay. You probably think of me as like an
long.
older guy without much to do who sit around and tell you stories.
These are great. I mean, this is for posterity. So yeah. I really appreciate it.
Well, there's some interesting stuff there. But as I said, you can see I get kind of sentimental about it. It was just a remarkable thing to be able to do. Because it was OSD, even though it's Deputy Assistant Secretary, it was a chance to really have an impact. And plus a great staff. And, they, one of the things I learned at university, I'm sure you have too, is that just empower people as much as they want. So there'd be some thing that we needed to say to some particular country, and I'd always choose the desk officer to go. And I said it wasn't, but I'd get ahead to the country receiving and say, it's not about status. I said, I want this person to get to know you. And you know how Asia is. If you say that, they'll sort of take them under the wing and all of that, rather than saying, why aren't you here? Or the secretary himself. No. This person is the future, and you need to have a relationship with him. So it was fun to do that. So those professorial habits were great.